Henrietta, remembered by history as Lady Henrietta Fitzjames, Baroness Waldegrave, and Viscountess Galmoy, the eldest illegitimate daughter of King James II of England, and one of the quietest, most steadfastly loyal figures of the entire Jacobite age. She was born into a world of candlelight and whispered prayers, the daughter of a man who would one day wear a crown, though no crown would ever rest upon her own head. Raised in the shadow of a glittering court, she grew up understanding her place with painful precision, close enough to royalty to feel its warmth, never quite close enough to claim its shelter as her right. She married young, faithfully, into a Catholic family that staked its entire future on her father's reign. And then the world turned in a single season. A revolution crossed the water, a king fled his own throne, and Henrietta, barely 21 years old, in a foreign country, with young children and a husband who would be dead within weeks of their arrival in France, was left to rebuild her life among the exiles and the hopeful and the quietly forgotten. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you are returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a genuine pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we will share the calm, complete story of Lady Henrietta Fitzjames, the eldest illegitimate daughter of King James II of England, a woman whose life touched nearly every great drama of the late 17th century, told slowly and with care to help guide you into rest. We will move gently through the full sweep of her remarkable existence, from her birth in the candlelit apartments of Restoration London, to her years at the fragile and brilliant court of her royal father, to the morning in 1688, when everything she had known was swept away, and through the long, quiet decades of exile and return that followed. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which part of Henrietta's story moved you, most help keep these tales coming. To understand the woman Henrietta Fitzjames would become, we must first understand the world into which she arrived, a world of restored monarchy, of incense and intrigue, of faith pressed quietly against the grain of a Protestant nation. It was a world in which the distance between a royal palace and a private house around the corner was measured not in miles, but in legitimacy, in whether one's parents had stood before a priest in a church that England recognized, in whether the child who emerged from that union carried, in the strict legal sense, the right to the name and the standing and the protection of the father's house. And in that narrow but enormously significant gap, Henrietta Fitzjames would spend her entire life, always within sight of the throne, never upon it, always near enough to royalty to feel its warmth, never close enough to claim its shelter as her right. England in the 1660s was a country still finding its balance after the most catastrophic internal crisis of its history, the Civil War that had torn it apart through the 1640s, that terrible conflict between king and parliament, between different visions of what England should be and where authority ultimately rested, had left marks on the nation's memory that didn't easily fade. The execution of King Charles V in January of 1649 had shocked not merely England but all of Europe. A king, the Lord's anointed, tried by a court of his own subjects, convicted of treason against his own people, and beheaded in the cold morning light of Whitehall. It was an act so unprecedented in its symbolic violence that contemporaries could scarcely find a language adequate to it. And then England had passed through 11 years of Republican and Protectorate government under Oliver Cromwell. Years that were, for many people, years of austerity and religious severity, of pleasure suppressed, and the ordinary rhythms of life subjected to a moral scrutiny more demanding than the English had been accustomed to. When King Charles II was restored to his throne in May of 1660, the country exhaled with something that resembled genuine collective relief. The diarist Samuel Pepys, who was there in London when the king arrived, wrote of the bells ringing and the bonfires burning and the streets crowded with people crying out their welcome. There was music again, and laughter, and theatre. The court of Charles II became, within months of the Restoration, one of the most brilliantly and scandalously entertaining in Europe, a place of wit and beauty and deliberate excess, as though the king and his courtiers had collectively resolved to compensate for the grey austerity that had preceded it. Charles II was charming, intellectually curious, personally lazy in some respects, but remarkably shrewd in others, and famously fond of women. He acknowledged at least 12 illegitimate children from various relationships, and the culture of his court reflected his personal temperament in the most direct possible way. It was a world in which certain kinds of human arrangement, the royal mistress, the acknowledged illegitimate child, the intersection of private affection and political advancement, were conducted with an openness that later ages would find startling. Into this world came the Churchill family, quietly, loyally, and with the particular kind of purposeful ambition that royalist families who had suffered for their loyalty carried into the Restoration. Sir Winston Churchill, a committed royalist through the years of the Civil War and the interregnum, became a member of Parliament and a court historian when Charles II came home. His family was drawn into the inner circles of royal life as naturally as moths are drawn to flame, and it was from this family that Henrietta's mother came. Arabella Churchill was born in February of 1648, one of those quiet, unremarkable births that would, in time, carry enormous weight. By the standards of the Restoration Court, she was not considered a great beauty. Contemporary accounts described her as plain and thin, and at least one courtier observed with the casual cruelty that court life permitted that the family's only feeling about her eventual rise was a joyful surprise that so plain a girl had attained such high preferment. And yet Arabella had something, some quality of warmth or steadiness, or personality that the historical record cannot fully preserve, because when she was sent to court in 1663, at the age of approximately 15, to serve as a maid of honour to the Duchess of York, she did not remain unnoticed for long. The Duchess of York was Anne Hyde, the daughter of Edward Hyde, the first Earl of Clarendon, and the wife of James, Duke of York. James was the younger brother of King Charles II, and in those years before Charles produced a legitimate heir, he stood as heir presumptive to the English throne. He was a man of considerable personal complexity, brave in the physical sense, having served with genuine distinction in naval campaigns, rigid and doctrinaire in matters of principle, and constitutionally inclined toward romantic entanglement in ways that his growing religious conviction did not always successfully restrain. By 1665, approximately 2 years after Arabella had taken her place in the Duchess of York's household, he had noticed her, and she had become his mistress in a relationship that would prove far more lasting and far more significant than anyone involved could have anticipated. It would endure for somewhere between 8 and 13 years, surviving the death of Anne Hyde in 1671, surviving James's second marriage to Mary of Modena in 1673, surviving the gradual erosion of novelty that ended so many such arrangements, and it produced 4 children who carried the surname Fitzjames. In the Anglo-Norman tradition, Fitzjames meant simply son of James. It was a name that acknowledged the paternity without claiming the legitimacy. placing these children in the particular social category that the 17th century had developed a fairly nuanced set of conventions for managing. Acknowledged royal bastards, provided for but outside the formal line of succession, raised with care but without the full weight of royal formalities surrounding them. It was into the early years of this relationship that Henrietta Fitz-James was born in the year 1667 at a private house on St. James's Square in Westminster, London. The exact day of her birth is not recorded, and history has not preserved that detail for us, though the year is certain and St. James's Square is confirmed. She was the eldest of the 4 children Arabella would bear to James, Duke of York, and she arrived into a world that was, for all its surface brilliance, built upon foundations of religious tension that were already beginning in the year of her birth to crack in ways that would eventually be catastrophic. Through her father, Henrietta carried blood of extraordinary distinction. Her paternal grandfather was King Charles I of England, the martyred king whose execution had defined the political world her parents had grown up in, whose death in January of 1649 had shocked the Christian kingdoms of Europe and left a scar on the English national memory that no subsequent healing had entirely closed. Her paternal grandmother was Henrietta Maria of France, the daughter of King Henri IV of France and Marie de Medici, a woman of formidable character who had spent years in exile herself, watching her husband's kingdom fall apart, enduring the loss of power and comfort, and eventually of the husband whose cause she had championed with fierce, unwavering devotion. It was from this grandmother that Henrietta Fitz-James took her Christian name, Henrietta, a name that connected her across the generation of her illegitimate birth to the French royal house from which her father's family descended, and to the particular tradition of Catholic royal exile that her own life would eventually echo in ways that felt, to those who noticed them, almost fated. Through her mother, the connections were no less remarkable, though differently textured. Arabella's brother was John Churchill, a young man at this point in the early stages of a military career, but one who would eventually become the first Duke of Marlborough, the most celebrated British military commander of his age, the man whose victories at Blenheim and Ramillies and Oudenarde and Malplaquet would set the limits of French power in Europe and secure for England a position of continental influence that lasted a generation. The Churchill connection would thread through Henrietta's life in ways that were sometimes warm and sometimes deeply ironic, for her brother James Fitz-James would spend the greater part of his military career commanding French and Spanish forces in direct opposition to his own uncle Marlborough, across the killing grounds of the War of the Spanish Succession. In one of the more poignant examples, history offers of a family divided permanently and painfully by the politics of faith and loyalty. Henrietta was raised Catholic. This was not, in the England of her day, a small or inconsequential thing. To be Catholic in Restoration England was to exist at a persistent angle to the official life of the nation, to worship in private, to navigate the laws that barred Catholics from public office and restricted their civic participation, to be aware at every turn that the great institutions of the country had not been designed with people of your faith in mind. The Test Acts, which James II would later attempt to suspend, codified in law what popular Protestant sentiment had always maintained in practice, that England was a Protestant country, and that its Catholics, however loyal, were in some formal sense outside the community it defined as its own. And yet the household of the Duke of York was not a powerless one, and Henrietta's childhood, though illegitimate in the legal sense, was not a childhood of poverty or obscurity. She grew up with access to the court, to the culture and connections of the Restoration world, and to the knowledge that her father was one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. the heir to the throne of England, a man whose household employed hundreds of people and whose political significance touched every corner of national life. She grew up with siblings too, 3 younger children whom Arabella bore to James in the years that followed, and who would each, in their different ways, live lives as remarkable and as shaped by their father's faith and their father's choices as Henrietta's own. James Fitzjames arrived in August of 1670, born at Moulins in France, while Arabella was travelling abroad, and from his earliest years he showed the qualities that would eventually make him one of the most formidable soldiers in Europe. He was quick of mind and strong of body, educated in France at a series of Catholic institutions including the Jesuit College of La Flèche, and he entered military service young, fighting against the Ottoman Turks at the Siege of Buda in Hungary in 1686, before returning to England to take command under his father's patronage. He had the physical courage that James II himself possessed, combined with a tactical intelligence that contemporaries recognized as genuinely uncommon, and the career he built in the French service after the Glorious Revolution would carry him to the rank of Marshal of France under Louis XIV, and to a permanent place among the celebrated commanders of European history. Henry Fitzjames followed in August of 1673, born at St. James's Square as Henrietta had been, a quieter, less celebrated figure, who served in various military capacities and who married a French noblewoman, but never achieved the distinction of his elder brother, and who would die young in France at the age of 29 in December of 1702. And finally, in 1674, came Arabella Fitzjames, named after her mother, a girl who would eventually take the veil and live out her days as Sister Ignatia in the Benedictine Abbey at Pontoise, France, finding in the enclosed religious life the peace and permanence that the turbulent secular world could not easily offer to a woman of her position, and whose choice of Pontoise would later acquire a particular significance in Henrietta's own story. These 4 children, Henrietta, James, Henry, and young Arabella, were the Fitzjames family. Illegitimate in law, they were acknowledged, raised, and in the case of the boys, generously provided for by their father. Henrietta, as the eldest, occupied a particular place among them, the firstborn of Arabella Churchill's great royal relationship, the eldest daughter of a man who was steadily moving toward a throne, the anchor of a family whose future was inseparably bound to the political and religious choices of its royal father. Alongside her Fitzjames siblings, Henrietta also had half-siblings from her father's 2 legitimate marriages. From James's first marriage to Anne Hyde, 8 children were born in total, but most died in infancy. Only 2 survived to adulthood. Mary, born in April of 1662, and Anne, born in February of 1665. Both of these half-sisters would go on to become reigning queens of England, Mary II and Queen Anne, while their illegitimate half-sister Henrietta lived her life in an entirely quieter and more contingent sphere. It is one of the more striking arrangements of fate in this particular family that the 2 daughters who wore crowns were the ones born within a formal marriage, and the one who did not was the one who would demonstrate, through all the upheavals of the century, the most consistent and costly personal loyalty to the man who fathered them all. From James's second marriage to Mary of Modena, 7 children were born, but again, most died young. Only 2 survived into adulthood: James Francis Edward Stuart, the Prince of Wales known to posterity as the Old Pretender, born on the 10th of June 1688, and Louisa Maria Theresa, born in 1692, who died of smallpox at 19. The birth of James Francis Edward, a Catholic male heir to a Catholic king, arriving at precisely the moment when Protestant England's patience with a Catholic monarch had reached its absolute limits. would be the spark that ignited the Glorious Revolution and changed the course of Henrietta's life entirely. But that reckoning was still in the future. In the early years of her childhood, Henrietta grew up in the warmth of the Restoration Court, in a household shaped by her father's growing prominence and her mother's discreet and carefully managed position. She was educated, she was Catholic, she was loved, and she watched, as intelligent children do, the adults around her navigating a world far more complicated than its polished surface suggested. She absorbed, without perhaps fully understanding what she was absorbing, the lesson that her family's situation required a particular kind of awareness, the awareness to be loyal without being reckless, to be faithful without being destroyed by faithfulness, and to be resilient enough to survive the consequences when the great men around her made choices that swept those who depended on them along in their wake. It is worth pausing here to consider what a Catholic childhood in the Restoration Court actually looked like, what the daily texture of it was, what it meant to grow up in a faith that was simultaneously the faith of the royal household and the faith that the English state officially regarded with suspicion and restricted by law. The household of the Duke of York in the 1670s was increasingly openly Catholic. James had converted, or was in the process of converting, and he made less and less effort to conceal his religious allegiance as the decade progressed. Henrietta and her siblings would have been educated in the Catholic faith through the network of Catholic chaplains and Catholic teachers that served the recusant community. Men who moved between Catholic households with the discretion that the times required, carrying the sacraments and the catechism and the whole apparatus of a faith that had no official standing in the country where it was being practiced. They would have attended Mass in private chapels, learned their prayers in Latin, received their First Communion and their confirmation within the Catholic rite, and absorbed from their earliest years the consciousness of belonging to a community that was, in the official life of the country, an outside group. This was not a consciousness of persecution. The household of the Duke of York was too powerful for that, but it was a consciousness of difference, of particularity, of the awareness that one's faith was something to be maintained and protected, rather than simply expressed in the open air of a welcoming public world. And this awareness, the particular awareness that comes from growing up as a member of a community that the dominant society defines as other, would prove, in the decades ahead, to be one of the most important things Henrietta's childhood gave her. Before we follow Henrietta forward into her own story, it is worth dwelling a moment longer on the remarkable woman who was her mother, because Arabella Churchill's life illuminates something important about the world Henrietta grew up in, and about the qualities of character that Henrietta herself would eventually need to draw upon. To understand a daughter fully, one must sometimes first understand the mother, and in Arabella Churchill's story, there is a template of quiet resilience and practical grace that would prove deeply relevant to the life her eldest child was about to live. The court of the Duke of York in the 1660s was not merely a social environment, it was a political one, saturated with the awareness of what the Duke's position represented and what the future might hold. James was the heir presumptive to the English throne in the years before Charles II fathered a legitimate child, which gave his household a particular charged quality, a sense that everything that happened within it might eventually matter in ways that exceeded its immediate significance. The women who served in the Duchess of York's household were not merely attending a noblewoman. They were adjacent to one of the great centres of power in England, and their personal relationships within that world could have consequences that extended far beyond the domestic. This was understood by everyone involved, including the young women themselves and their families, and the understanding shaped the culture of the household in ways that made it simultaneously glamorous and treacherous, full of opportunity and full of risk. Arabella had arrived at the Duchess of York's household as a girl of 15, sent to court in the time-honoured fashion of good families, seeking to advance their daughters through proximity to power. The position of maid of honour combined service and social opportunity in roughly equal measure, and the Duke of York's household was, in those years, one of the most politically significant establishments in England. What happened once Arabella arrived, the slow development of the relationship with James that would eventually produce 4 children and last for the better part of a decade, was not planned and was not, in any straightforward sense, entirely within her control. She was a young woman at the centre of one of the most powerful courts in Europe, and the attention of the heir presumptive to the English throne was not something that could be easily refused or easily managed out of existence once it had been offered. The social structure of the court and the power differential between a royal duke and a 15-year-old maid of honour made refusal a theoretical option that the practical reality of the situation did not make available in any straightforward way. Contemporary observers puzzled over the attraction. Arabella was not, by the fashionable standards of the Restoration Court, considered beautiful. The lush, dark-eyed, full-figured aesthetic that the portraiture of the period celebrates in abundant detail was not her type. She was thin, described by at least one unkind contemporary as notably plain, and the observation that her family's only feeling about her rise was joyful surprise has been quoted so often in the historical literature that it has become the defining characterization of her appearance. And yet this characterization tells us more about the cruelty of courtly observation than about Arabella herself, because what it cannot explain is why the relationship lasted. If James had been drawn to Arabella merely by the novelty of her availability, the arrangement would have been short-lived. The court offered abundant alternatives, and novelty, by its nature, does not endure. The fact that the relationship persisted for years, through Anne Hyde's death, through James's remarriage, through the pressures that the new Duchess of York brought to bear against it, suggests something more substantial. Steadiness, perhaps, or a quality of genuine warmth, or the particular comfort that comes from a relationship in which both parties can be more themselves than the formal demands of court life otherwise permit. Arabella's brother John Churchill secured his first military commission through his sister's position, an ensign's place in the King's Regiment of Foot Guards, dated 1667, the same year that Henrietta was born. This was the launching pad for the trajectory that would eventually carry John Churchill to the rank of Captain General of the British Army, to the Dukedom of Marlborough, to the building of Blenheim Palace as a monument to his victories, and to a permanent place among the great commanders in European military history. John Churchill's career was built on talent, certainly. He possessed military gifts of the very highest order, but it was enabled, in its critical early stages, by the connection that his sister's position had created, and this was understood at the time, and accepted as entirely natural within the economy of a world in which family loyalty and the use of social connection were not merely permitted, but expected and admired. Arabella's other brothers benefited similarly. George Churchill rose to become an admiral in the Royal Navy. Charles Churchill became a general in the British Army. The family's collective advancement across the late 17th and early 18th centuries was built, in significant part, upon the foundation that Arabella's particular rise had provided. The relationship between Arabella and James wound down over the course of the early to mid-1670s. The precise chronology is uncertain. The sources give slightly different accounts, and the dissolution appears to have been gradual rather than abrupt, but the broad outline is clear. James's second marriage to Mary of Modena in September of 1673 brought to his household a young wife of strong Catholic conviction and considerable personal determination, who found the continued presence of a royal mistress intolerable, and said so with a directness that made her position unmistakable. She refused to eat. She wept. She appealed to her confessor and her prayers, and whatever leverage a 15-year-old princess who had just been married off to a middle-aged foreign king could bring to bear on a situation she found offensive. The pressure worked, eventually, though not immediately, and by somewhere around 1678, a younger woman named Catherine Sedley had become James's primary romantic attachment, and Arabella's years of active favour were definitively over. It is worth noting, at this point, something about the way that the end of this relationship played out for the Fitzjames children, for Henrietta specifically, who was approximately 11 years old, when her mother's relationship with James finally concluded. Old enough to understand something of what was happening, even if not to fully comprehend its political and social dimensions. The children did not lose their father when their mother lost his favour. James continued to acknowledge his Fitzjames children, to provide for them, and to involve himself in their lives and futures as an active paternal figure. The end of the romantic relationship between James and Arabella did not translate into any diminishment of his parental responsibilities toward the children they had produced together. This was not unusual in the world of royal bastards. The conventions of the period were fairly clear on the point that acknowledged illegitimate children remained acknowledged even when the circumstances of their conception had changed. But it was nonetheless significant for Henrietta's experience, because it meant that her relationship with her father continued through and after the dissolution of her parents' arrangement, and that the connections and the care and the sense of paternal presence that her father represented did not simply disappear when her mother's time of royal favour ended. She was provided for. A house in St. James's Square, a pension, the acknowledgement of her 4 children by their father, and in 1680, she married a man named Charles Godfrey, an army officer and politician, who appears from the evidence to have been genuinely devoted to her, and she went on to have 3 more children with him and to live what seems to have been a long and largely contented life. The marriage to Godfrey is one of those small biographical details that can easily be passed over, but that deserves a moment's attention, because it tells us something important about what kind of woman Arabella Churchill was. She had been the king's mistress for a decade. She had borne 4 acknowledged royal children. She had occupied a position that was, in the social and political world of the Restoration Court, one of the most conspicuous and most closely observed that any woman could hold. And then, when that period of her life was over, she married a perfectly ordinary man, an army officer, a politician of no particular distinction, and apparently settled into a genuinely happy domestic life without apparent bitterness or nostalgia. This capacity for acceptance, for moving forward, without dwelling on what had been lost, was part of the same character that had made her valuable to James in the first place, and it was the character that Henrietta, growing up watching her mother, had the opportunity to observe and to learn from. Arabella Churchill. Godfrey died in May of 1730 at the age of 82, and was buried in the Westminster Abbey tomb of her brother, the Duke of Marlborough, the brother whose early career her position had helped to make possible, and who had predeceased her by 8 years, a fact that demonstrates the extraordinary longevity of a woman who had lived through almost the entire sweep of what historians call the long 17th century. She outlived her daughter Henrietta by approximately 7 weeks. Both women died in the spring of 1730, Henrietta on the 3rd of April, Arabella in May. Mother and daughter in the same year, barely 2 months apart. the 82-year-old mother outliving the 63-year-old daughter by so small a margin that it has the quality of a detail the historical record might have invented for its own symbolic satisfaction, had it not been simply and plainly true. It is this mother, practical, discreet, capable of navigating complex circumstances with a steady grace that preserved both her dignity and her family's interests across more than 6 decades, whose qualities we can sometimes see reflected in the choices Henrietta made across the course of her own life. The circumstances were different, the century was changing around them, and the daughter was not the mother, but the temperament, the capacity to adapt without surrendering, to be faithful without being destroyed by faithfulness, to find the quiet middle way through situations that offered no entirely satisfying resolution, that seemed to have been a gift passed between them in whatever way such gifts are transmitted from one generation to the next. It is also worth noting, in considering Arabella's influence on Henrietta, the particular model that Arabella provided of what a woman in a precarious social position could do to create stability for herself and her children. The world of Restoration England was not, in any formal sense, kind to women who occupied Arabella's position, who had been royal mistresses, who had borne illegitimate children, who existed outside the formal structures of recognized marriage. The law provided them with no particular protection. The social conventions of the age had a way of categorizing such women that left little room for the kind of dignified later life that Arabella actually managed to create. And yet, Arabella created it through practical intelligence, through discretion, through the management of her own affairs with the kind of steady competence that prevents the small disasters of daily life from becoming larger ones. She survived. She married a man who loved her. She raised her second family. She lived to 82. These are not small achievements. They are, in the specific context of her situation, remarkable ones, and they were achieved not through any dramatic assertion of independence or any public claim to rights or recognition, but through exactly the kind of quiet, persistent, practical management of a complicated situation that the 17th century offered to women as their primary tool for navigating a world that had not been designed with their interests primarily in mind. Henrietta watched this and learned from it, not consciously, not through any explicit instruction, but through the absorptive process by which children learn from the most significant adults in their world. You could be dealt a difficult hand, Arabella's life said, and you could still manage it with dignity. The management required patience and discretion, and the willingness to accept constraints that were not fair but were real. It required, above all, the ability to keep your eye on what mattered, on the children, on the faith, on the small domestic certainties that could be preserved even when the larger world was unreliable. Henrietta had this ability, or she developed it, and when the larger world became unreliable in ways that exceeded anything Arabella had had to deal with, when a revolution swept away a throne and a husband died in 6 weeks, she drew on whatever she had learned from watching her mother navigate her own smaller catastrophes, and she survived. The years of Henrietta's adolescence, from roughly the early to mid-1670s to the early 1680s, are not richly documented. We know she was raised Catholic, that she grew up in and around the Restoration Court, and that she arrived at the appropriate age for marriage in the possession of the combination of qualities her particular background provided. Royal blood on her father's side, a family name on her mother's side that had become, through John Churchill's rising career, one of the more distinguished military names in England, and the particular social position of an acknowledged royal illegitimate daughter, above the common nobility in blood, below the legitimate royals in formal standing, dependent in every practical sense on the continued goodwill of the father, whose choices had defined the conditions of her existence. She was, in other words, precisely the kind of young woman for whom a carefully arranged marriage to a solid, loyal Catholic family was not merely a social convenience, but a genuine necessity, the mechanism by which the precariousness of her position could be transformed, at least in part, into something more stable and secure. And from watching her mother, she would have learned something important about how such positions are navigated. Arabella Churchill had not been destroyed by the complicated circumstances of her relationship with James. She had managed all of it with a steadiness that preserved her dignity, her children's futures, and her own sense of self across decades of a situation that offered abundant opportunities for bitterness and self-destruction. Henrietta, watching this across the years of her childhood and adolescence, would have absorbed the lesson, not necessarily consciously, not as a set of principles articulated and adopted, but in the way that children absorb the models that their most significant adults provide. You could be dealt a complicated hand, Arabella's life seemed to say, and you could still play it well. The cards mattered less than the quality of attention you brought to the playing of them. This was, it would turn out, precisely the lesson that Henrietta's own life was going to require her to have learned. In the year 1685, when Henrietta Fitzjames was approximately 18 years old, the world she had grown up in shifted dramatically. On the 6th of February, King Charles II of England died at the age of 54, after a final illness of 5 days, having converted quietly to Catholicism on his deathbed in a gesture that, whatever its spiritual sincerity, was too private and too late to change anything about the political reality that followed. He had reigned for 25 years since the Restoration, and he left behind a kingdom that was, in many respects, more stable than the one he had inherited, but whose religious and political tensions remained unresolved at the deepest level. He had managed those tensions throughout his reign, with a kind of brilliant pragmatic evasiveness, the same quality that led contemporaries to call him the Merry Monarch, and to note that he never said a foolish thing and never did a wise one, was also the quality that allowed him to keep England's religious divisions from reaching a crisis point through a combination of charm and flexibility, and the willingness to retreat when advancing would have been too costly. His successor possessed none of these qualities. Charles's death had been anticipated for some time. His health had been declining, and the lack of a legitimate heir had been the subject of political anxiety for years. The attempts by Whig politicians in the late 1670s and early 1680s to pass the Exclusion Bill, which would have barred James from the succession on the grounds of his Catholicism, had failed, largely because Charles had refused to be manoeuvred into accepting any limitation on royal prerogative, and had used his considerable political skills to defeat the bill without conceding any principle. But the failure of exclusion had left the Protestant establishment in a state of unresolved anxiety, aware that a Catholic succession was coming and deeply uncertain about what it would mean. The answer, as it turned out, was 3 years of intensifying crisis followed by revolution. And so James, Duke of York, Henrietta's father, became King James II of England, King James VII of Scotland, and King of Ireland. He was 51 years old, and he was now the most powerful man in the 3 kingdoms. For Henrietta, the transformation was not without personal weight. The man who had been her father, the Duke, the royal heir, the figure of private paternal connection, was now a king, and the court that had always been central to her world was now the full royal court of England. Her half-sisters Mary and Anne were the daughters of a reigning monarch. Her brother James Fitzjames was now, in every sense that the world could recognize, the son of a king. And Henrietta herself, illegitimate, Catholic and loyal, found herself in a position that was both elevated by the new reign's proximity and already complicated by the religious and political storms that had been gathering on the horizon for years and were now, with James on the throne, approaching with the certainty of weather. For the Catholic community that had maintained its faith through the long decades of Protestant supremacy, the accession of James II was a moment of extraordinary, cautious hope. Here, at last, was a king of their faith, a man who would not merely tolerate them, but would, they hoped, actively work to create conditions in which English Catholics could live their lives without the legal penalties and social marginalization that had defined Catholic existence in England for the better part of a century. The joy of the Catholic community at James's accession was real, if carefully expressed. The memory of what Protestant reaction could look like was too recent and too vivid for anyone to celebrate too openly. But within Catholic households, and particularly within the household of the Fitzjames family, which was positioned at the very centre of the new Catholic court, the change in circumstances must have felt genuinely significant. After years of worshipping privately, of navigating official structures that were not designed for people of their faith, of bearing the consciousness of being an outside group within the nation of their birth, the Catholics of England suddenly had a king who shared their faith and who intended to use his power to change the conditions of their lives. The reign began with genuine promise, or at least with genuine enthusiasm on the part of those who shared the new king's faith and his vision. James was experienced in government, having served his brother in various administrative capacities over many years. He was personally courageous. His service in naval campaigns had demonstrated a willingness to expose himself to genuine danger that commanded respect, even among those who disagreed with his politics. He was, by the standards of the time, a man of real conviction, genuinely committed to what he believed was right, which unfortunately included a vision of England's religious and political future that the Protestant establishment of the country found deeply and consistently alarming. From the very beginning of his reign, James tested the limits of what Protestant England would accept. He placed Catholic officers in the army in defiance of the Test Acts, including, notably, Irish Catholic officers who had no prior connection to the English military tradition and whose appointment was therefore read as doubly provocative. He suspended those same Test Acts, which had been the legal mechanism by which Catholics were excluded from public office, using the royal prerogative in a way that the common lawyers of England considered at best constitutionally questionable and at worst flatly illegal. He issued declarations of indulgence intended to grant freedom of worship to Catholics and Protestant dissenters alike, a measure that, in other circumstances and at other times, might have been welcomed as genuine toleration, but that, in the specific context of James II's reign, was widely understood as a political maneuver to build a coalition of nonconformists behind the Catholic interest, and that was resented accordingly. He attempted to reshape the municipal corporations of England, replacing local officials with men sympathetic to his religious program in advance of a general election he hoped to control. He dispensed individual Catholics from the requirements of the law through the exercise of his dispensing power, a constitutional practice whose legality was genuinely disputed and whose aggressive use by James set the judiciary and the political establishment on edge. Each of these actions was, in James's own understanding, a measure of toleration, an attempt to create space for his co-religionists in a country that had treated them as second-class subjects for generations. To the Anglican establishment, each one was a step toward the thing they feared above all others: a Catholic England, governed by a Catholic king, with a Catholic succession stretching forward into an indefinite and intolerable future. The birth of a Catholic male heir in June of 1688 was the event that transformed this fear from theoretical to urgent, and from urgent to irresistible. It was in these years of his father's reign that Henrietta's brother James FitzJames began his own remarkable ascent. In 1687, James II created the young man Duke of Berwick, a title that honoured the royal blood while acknowledging the illegitimate reality of his birth, and appointed him governor of Portsmouth. Young Berwick had already served with distinction in the campaigns against the Ottoman Turks in Hungary, fighting at the siege of Buda in 1686, and had shown a natural military talent that his contemporaries were beginning to recognize as genuinely extraordinary. He was being positioned, it seemed, for a great career at the centre of the Catholic court his father was building. One of the most visible signs of James II's intention to bring Catholics into the positions of power and responsibility from which they had been excluded for so long. The reign of James II lasted 3 years. 3 years. The brevity of it, in relation to the weight it carries in English history, is one of the more striking proportions in the entire Stuart story. In 3 years, James managed to alarm the Protestant establishment so thoroughly that it invited a foreign prince to invade, managed to see his support evaporate from under him with a speed that had no parallel in English history, and managed to flee his kingdom in the winter of 1688, with nothing to show for the ambition and the conviction he had brought to the throne. By the standards of the long 17th century, which had already contained 2 civil wars, a regicide, a republic, a protectorate, and a restoration, his reign was another chapter in a century that seemed constitutionally incapable of settling into stability. By the standards of his own hopes and intentions, it was a complete and catastrophic failure. The Catholic advancement that he had attempted, the insertion of Catholics into the army and the civil service, the suspension of the Test Acts, the diplomatic reorientation of England toward Catholic France, had lasted barely long enough to generate the alarm that destroyed it. But for the women and men who had organized their lives around the assumption of James's continuing reign, the brevity was not merely a historical fact, it was a personal one. Henrietta had married in 1683, before the accession, when James was still Duke of York, and the prospects were uncertain. She had watched her husband rise through the court of James II, watched him receive his barony and his appointment as comptroller and his ambassadorship. She had borne her children in the warmth of a court that, for 3 years, was not merely tolerant of her faith, but actively shaped by it. The life she had been building was a life suited to the world that her father's reign was creating, a Catholic life near the centre of power, with a husband whose advancement depended on the continued existence of that world. And when the world ended, as it did in the autumn of 1688, the life she had been building ended with it. To understand why the reign failed with such speed and such completeness, it is necessary to understand something about the man who had spent his life preparing for it. James II was, in many respects, an admirable man by the personal standards that the 17th century valued most. He was personally brave. His naval service had demonstrated a willingness to expose himself to genuine danger that contemporaries, even those who disagreed profoundly with his politics, consistently acknowledged and respected. He was genuinely pious, not in the way of a monarch who used religion as a political instrument, while privately caring nothing for it, but in the way of a man who had converted to a faith that cost him enormously, and who maintained that conversion with an unwavering consistency that never failed under pressure. He was loyal to those who were loyal to him. He was, by the standards of his age, sincerely committed to the principle of religious toleration. His declarations of indulgence were intended not merely as Catholic advancement, but as a broader opening of English public life to all who had been excluded from it on grounds of religious conscience, and the principle behind them was one that later ages would come to regard as enlightened and ahead of its time. These are not small qualities. They are qualities worth noting in a historical tradition that has often been content to characterize James as simply a bigot and a fool. He was neither. What he lacked was flexibility, the ability to distinguish between what was right in principle and what was achievable in the specific political conditions of late 17th century England, and to sacrifice the speed of the former for the sake of the survival of the latter. His brother Charles II had possessed this flexibility in exceptional measure, managing England's religious and political tensions through a combination of charm, patience, and the willingness to retreat from positions that were morally correct when maintaining them was politically unsustainable. James possessed none of this. When he believed something was right, and he believed, with perfect sincerity, that the restoration of Catholics to their rightful place in English public life was right, he pursued it with a directness and a speed that left no room for the accommodation and the gradualism that might have made it achievable without triggering the very crisis it was designed to resolve. He was a man of principle, moving through a political world that required flexibility, and the collision was, in retrospect, almost inevitable from the first day of his reign. It is important to hold this personal dimension in mind when reading the larger historical narrative of the Glorious Revolution, because the larger narrative, which is rightly concerned with constitutional principles and the balance of religious power in England, can give the impression that the events of 1688 were primarily ideological, primarily abstract, primarily about the resolution of competing theories and claims. They were also, and just as essentially, about people, about Henrietta, 21 years old, with small children and a rising husband and a life that had just found its intended shape, about Henry Waldegrave, 27 years old, at the beginning of an ambassadorship that was supposed to launch him into a distinguished diplomatic career, about hundreds of other families in similar positions, whose lives the revolution destroyed with the comprehensive indifference to individual circumstance that great political events always show toward the people caught within them. For Henrietta herself, these years of her father's reign had a texture that the later disasters make it easy to overlook. They were, in the human and domestic sense, among the best years of her adult life. She was young. Her husband was rising. Her children were small, and her household was secure, and her father was king. The world that had always required careful navigation, the world of Catholic illegitimacy in Protestant England, was, for this brief season, a world in which careful navigation had paid off in the way it is supposed to, but rarely does. And then it was over, and the reckoning had come, and the lives of everyone in that court were upended by a revolution that none of them had found a way to prevent. Meanwhile, in the slightly earlier period of James's reign, Henrietta herself had already made the most significant personal decision of her young life. She had married, and the marriage had produced children, and the household she had established with her husband was, in those brief years before the revolution, one of the small domestic facts that gave the larger world of the court its human texture. We will turn now to that marriage directly, to the man she married, to the years of their life together, and to the catastrophe that ended it. On the 29th of November, 1683, some 2 years before James II's accession, while her father was still Duke of York, Henrietta Fitzjames, aged approximately 16, married Henry Waldegrave. He was 22 years old, a young man of a family that represented a very particular and very English kind of Catholic tradition, one that had maintained its faith not through drama or martyrdom, but through the quiet, stubborn persistence of a household that simply refused, year after year and generation after generation, to conform. The Waldegraves were one of the old Reckerson gentry families that had maintained their Catholic faith through the long decades of Protestant supremacy, with a loyalty that had cost them significantly in legal penalties and social exclusion, but had not broken them. Recusancy, the formal refusal to attend Church of England services, carried with it a schedule of fines under the recusancy laws that had been on the books since the Elizabethan period, and families like the Waldegraves had paid those fines, decade after decade, as the price of religious conscience. They worshipped privately in their own chapel, attended by private chaplains who moved between Catholic households with the careful discretion that the times required. They educated their sons through unofficial Catholic networks that maintained connections to the continent, and they navigated the formal institutions of the country, its courts, its local offices, its social hierarchies, with the awareness of people who understood that those institutions had not been designed with them in mind, but who had learned, over generations, to operate within them anyway. They were not great courtiers, not political adventurers, not men of spectacular fortune or famous names. They were, instead, exactly the kind of family that a Catholic king and a Catholic father might choose for an illegitimate daughter, solid, faithful, respectable, and deeply committed to the religious tradition that James himself held most dear. The match combined Henrietta's royal blood and her father's patronage with the Waldegrave family's ancient English standing and unimpeachable Catholic credentials, and it satisfied the requirements of both families' situations with the neat symmetry that good arranged marriages in this period were designed to achieve. Henry Waldegrave was the son of Sir Charles Waldegrave, 3rd Baronet, and he would inherit the baronetcy himself around 1684, shortly after his marriage. He had been educated in the Catholic tradition and had grown up with the awareness of what that faith required, not merely in the interior sense of personal piety, but in the external sense of navigating an official world that did not share it, of maintaining connections and loyalties within a community that had learned to sustain itself through carefully managed invisibility. When he married Henrietta in November of 1683, he was marrying into a connection that was extraordinary by any measure. The acknowledged daughter of the heir to the English throne, a young woman whose bloodline traced directly to the royal house of Stuart on one side and the most distinguished military family in England on the other. The wedding was held in Westminster, the neighbourhood where Henrietta had been born, in a Catholic ceremony conducted with the privacy that such ceremonies in England still required. It was a beginning. 2 young people, both Catholic, both deeply attached to the Stuart cause, both entering a world that seemed, in the autumn of 1683, to be moving toward conditions that might finally allow Catholics like themselves to live their lives in England with something approaching equality. The world of 1683 was, for English Catholics, a world on the cusp of change that was still uncertain in its direction. Charles II was still alive, but aging, and the prospect of his Catholic brother's succession was becoming more rather than less likely with each passing year. The exclusion crisis of 1678 to 1681, the attempt by Whig politicians to pass legislation barring James from the succession, had been defeated, and its defeat had left the Tory interest, which had supported the legitimate succession, in a stronger position than it had occupied before the crisis. James himself had been recalled from semi-exile and restored to his brother's confidence, and was once again playing an active role in the governance of the 3 kingdoms. For a Catholic family like the Waldegraves, the political horizon in the autumn of 1683 looked, for the first time in a generation, as though it might be brightening. Henry Waldegrave would have understood this context completely. He was marrying the acknowledged daughter of the man who was almost certainly going to be the next King of England, in a year when that kingship was beginning to look not merely possible, but probable. The match was, by any measure, an extraordinary opportunity, not in the mercenary sense of a calculation about advantage, but in the deeper sense of a connection to the cause and the community and the faith that had defined his family's identity for generations. Henrietta brought to the marriage the blood of kings and the acknowledged patronage of the heir to the throne. He brought to the marriage the solid respectability of a Catholic English family that had maintained its faith through a century of persecution. Together, they embodied the kind of Catholic English establishment that James II, when he became king, was going to need around him if his project of Catholic advancement was to have any chance of success. Whether Henry and Henrietta formed a genuine personal attachment to each other, whether their marriage was, in the emotional terms that later ages have prioritized, a happy one, is not something the historical record addresses. The sources that survive concerning Henrietta's first marriage are external and formal. The legal records of the ceremony, the records of the children's births, the documents of Henry's court appointments, the registers of his death, the interior of the marriage, the conversations they had, the ways they managed their household, the nature of their daily companionship, is as opaque to us as the interior of most 17th century marriages necessarily is. What we can say is that the marriage lasted for 5.5 years without any documented crisis or rupture, that it produced children, that Henry was given the highest positions his father-in-law could bestow, and that Henrietta followed her husband into exile in 1688, when the alternative would have been to stay in England without him. These are not proofs of deep romantic love in the modern sense, but they are indications of a functional and probably reasonably content partnership of two people who, placed together by the logic of their respective situations, found ways to build a shared life that worked. The consequences of the marriage for Henry became tangible within 2 years of the ceremony. When James II came to the throne in February of 1685, Henry Waldegrave's position changed immediately and dramatically. In 1686, as a direct result of his marriage to the king's daughter, he was elevated to the peerage as the first Baron Waldegrave of Chewton, Somerset. It was an act of royal recognition, the king acknowledging his son-in-law formally, incorporating the Waldegrave family into the innermost circle of the new Catholic court, and placing Henry in a position from which a distinguished career in the royal service was not merely possible, but entirely plausible. The years of James II's reign were, for Henrietta and Henry, years of genuine establishment and real domestic happiness, at least by the evidence the record provides. They had status, they had a home, they had children who arrived in the warmth of a court that favoured their family. Their eldest child, a son, James Waldegrave, was born in 1684, the year before James II's accession, and was from birth the inheritor of his father's baronetcy-in-waiting. A daughter, Arabella Waldegrave, followed in 1687. There may have been a third child, a second son named Henry, born around 1688, though the sources disagree on this point, and the matter cannot be resolved with certainty. What is beyond dispute is that Henrietta was building a family, a small Catholic household nestled within the broader warmth of the royal court's favour, its future apparently as assured as such things ever are in an uncertain world. The children would have been raised in the faith both parents shared, in the particular atmosphere of a court that was, in those brief years, the centre of Catholic power in England, surrounded by the ceremonies and the clergy and the daily rhythms of Catholic practice. that the Protestant establishment had spent a century attempting to extinguish, and that James II's reign had allowed, for this short and precious season, to live openly in the air. Henry's own career advanced in clear steps alongside his wife's family connection. In 1687, James appointed him Comptroller of the royal household, a significant administrative post that placed him at the centre of the king's domestic establishment, responsible for the management of the household staff and the complex logistics of a court that entertained and conducted the business of a kingdom. The appointment reflected real trust, and Henry appears to have served in it with the competence and reliability that his background suggested he would bring. The comptrollership was not a position that attracted historical attention for its own sake, but it was the kind of role through which a king's confidence in a man was most concretely demonstrated. The management of the domestic machinery of a royal household required someone who could be trusted with the daily reality of the king's private life, someone whose loyalty and discretion were beyond question. That James appointed Henry Waldegrave to this role speaks to the quality of the relationship between father-in-law and son-in-law, and to the degree to which the Waldegrave family had been incorporated into the innermost circle of James's personal trust. And then, in 1688, came the most prominent appointment of his brief career. He was named English ambassador to France, the official diplomatic representative of the English crown at the court of Louis XIV, who was by any measure the most formidable monarch in Europe, and who presided over the most sophisticated and demanding court on the continent. To be the English ambassador at Versailles was to be required to navigate the extraordinary social complexity of a court, in which precedents and protocol were not merely conventions, but the substance of political meaning, in which every gesture and every seating arrangement and every form of address carried diplomatic weight. Henry Waldegrave was 27 years old, newly appointed to an ambassadorship that would have seemed, 6 months earlier, the beginning of a long and distinguished diplomatic career. The appointment was a statement by James II to the world that his Catholic son-in-law was trusted with England's most important foreign relationship. And then the world he had been building that career within ceased to exist. What happened in 1688 was not gradual. It was sudden and total, and it came with the terrifying speed that only the most fundamental kind of political crisis can achieve. The birth of James Francis Edward Stuart on the 10th of June, the Catholic male heir whose arrival removed the last reason Protestant England had to endure a Catholic king in the expectation of Protestant successors, was the immediate trigger. Within weeks of that birth, 7 of the most powerful peers in England had sent a letter to William of Orange, husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, inviting him to invade. William landed in England on the 5th of November, a date whose resonance with the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, in which Catholic conspirators had attempted to blow up a Protestant parliament, was not lost on the Protestant commentators who celebrated his arrival. James found his support disintegrating around him with a speed that was almost surreal. Officers defecting, including the young John Churchill himself, the nephew of Arabella Churchill, and therefore Henrietta's cousin in some informal sense, who abandoned James for William in one of the most consequential acts of military treachery in English history. Prince George of Denmark, James's own son-in-law, abandoned him. His daughter Anne fled to join William's party, guided by Sarah Churchill, John Churchill's wife and Anne's intimate friend. In December, after a series of increasingly desperate attempts to stabilize a situation that was beyond any human power to stabilize, James II fled England. He crossed to France. He threw the Great Seal of England into the Thames as he went, a gesture that was both symbolic of his despair and practical in its intent, since without the Great Seal, no legislation could be formally enacted. And with that gesture, the reign of James II was over. For Henry Waldegrave, who had just been appointed ambassador to France, and who was now accompanying a deposed king to the country, whose court he was officially supposed to represent his master at, the speed of the collapse must have been staggering. He had gone from being a rising young peer at the heart of a functioning royal court to being the servant of an exile within the space of a few weeks. The appointment as ambassador had meant something very different from what it came to mean almost immediately. And then, 6 weeks after arriving at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, he was dead. Henrietta was 21 years old. The life she had spent 5 years building, the marriage, the children, the household, the place in the Catholic court that had finally seemed secure, had been destroyed twice. First, by the revolution that had ended the court's existence in England, and then by the death that had ended her husband's existence entirely. She was young, she was widowed, she was in a foreign country, and the father whose political choices had brought her to this position was now a pensioner of the French crown, sustained by the charity of a cousin who had his own political reasons for the generosity, living in a borrowed chateau that was being made to serve as a royal court by the sheer will of a man who refused to stop believing that he was, in the eyes of God and legitimate law, still a king. It was an extraordinary situation, and Henrietta, with small children and no husband, and no clear path forward, had to find a way to live within it. Henrietta and Henry were among those who followed. This was not a small decision. It meant leaving England, leaving the estates and the connections and the ordinary life that constituted their material existence, and casting their lot with a fallen king and a cause that most of Europe had already decided was finished. And yet they went. Henry, because his professional and personal obligations to James made staying behind an impossibility. Henrietta, because her father was her father, and because the faith she had been raised in and the loyalty she had been raised to feel were not things she was prepared to surrender for the sake of comfort. The exiled court settled at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, near Versailles. Louis XIV, a first cousin of James II by blood, and a man whose political and religious interests made support for the Jacobite cause broadly convenient, provided the chateau as a home for the exiled Stuart court, along with an annual pension of 600,000 livres, intended to support the household and the community gathering around it. It was a magnificent gesture, and a practically essential one, for it gave the exile court a physical home of appropriate grandeur and a financial basis without which the entire community would have been reduced immediately to genuine destitution. Henry Waldegrave continued as comptroller of the royal household in exile, confirmed also as ambassador to France in a role that had acquired overnight an entirely different meaning from the one it had carried when James was a reigning monarch. He was 27 years old, managing the domestic affairs of a court in exile, conducting diplomacy on behalf of a king whom almost no one outside France and the Jacobite community recognized as legitimately holding any throne. It was an extraordinary situation for a young man who had, only months earlier, been among the most promising figures of the English Catholic establishment. And then, on the 24th of January, 1689, barely 6 weeks after the exile court had settled at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Henry Waldegrave, first Baron Waldegrave, died. He was 27 years old. The cause of his death is not recorded. What killed him, whether illness or the physical stress of the flight, or some condition that the medicine of the day could neither identify nor treat, has not survived the centuries that separate us from that cold January morning in France. What we know is simply the fact. A young man who had seemed, only months before, to be at the beginning of a long and promising life, was gone. Henrietta was 21 years old. She was in a foreign country, in a borrowed court, with small children. The eldest perhaps 4 years old, the youngest an infant. And her husband was dead. The England she had grown up in was now ruled by her Protestant half-sister and a Dutch king. The world her father had tried to build had lasted 3 years and was finished, and the man who had been supposed to build a future with her was buried in France, far from the family estates in Navestock that would now pass to a child who could not read. It was, by any measure, a devastating beginning to what would prove to be a very long widowhood. The Glorious Revolution is sometimes described in the histories as an almost bloodless affair, a change of dynasty accomplished with remarkable efficiency and relatively little violence, at least on English soil. And by the standards of the revolutions that preceded and followed it, this characterization has some truth. There was no battle in England proper, no decisive military confrontation on English ground, no mass political violence of the kind that the French Revolution would later produce on a horrifying scale. William of Orange marched to London essentially unopposed, and James II chose flight over confrontation, perhaps because he had witnessed, in the history of his own father, where confrontation ultimately led. But bloodless in the formal military sense is not the same as painless in the human sense, and the experience of the Glorious Revolution for the people caught within it, for the families of the Catholic establishment, for the Jacobite community that would form in its wake, for the hundreds of individuals whose careers and livelihoods and social worlds had been built upon the assumption of James's continuing reign, was one of immediate, total, and in many cases permanent disruption. Estates were attainted. Men who had held high offices found themselves without either position or income. Women who had built their households around the connections and the patronage of the old Catholic court found themselves stripped of the material foundations those households had rested on. The Irish soldiers who had served James during the Irish campaign of 1689 to 1691, the campaign in which James attempted to reclaim his throne through Ireland and failed at the Battle of the Boyne, and in which the Jacobite Irish forces were finally crushed at Aughrim in 1691, faced the loss of their Irish lands and the choice of submission or exile. Most of the officers and many of the men chose exile, following James to France to become the Wild Geese, that remarkable community of Irish Catholic soldiers who would serve the kings of France and Spain for generations, carrying the colours of the old Ireland into the service of foreign courts. Henrietta and Henry were among those who followed James without hesitation. This was not a small decision. It meant leaving England, leaving the estates and the connections and the ordinary life that constituted their material existence, and casting their lot with a fallen king and a cause that most of Europe had already decided was finished. And yet they went. Henry, because his professional and personal obligations to James made staying behind an impossibility. Henrietta, because her father was her father, and because the faith she had been raised in and the loyalty she had been raised to feel were not things she was prepared to surrender for the sake of comfort. The loyalty that the Waldegrave family had maintained through generations of recusancy, the willingness to pay penalties and accept marginalization rather than abandon what they believed, was the same loyalty that Henrietta expressed now in its most costly possible form, by following a deposed king across the Channel into a future she could not see and had not chosen. The exiled court settled at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, near Versailles. Louis XV, a first cousin of James II by blood, and a man whose political and religious interests made support for the Jacobite cause broadly convenient, provided the château as a home for the exiled Stuart court, along with an annual pension of 600,000 livres intended to support the household and the community gathering around it. It was a magnificent gesture, and a practically essential one, for it gave the exile court a physical home of appropriate grandeur and a financial basis, without which the entire community would have been reduced immediately to genuine destitution. The chateau itself was large enough to accommodate not merely the immediate royal household, but a whole community of attendants and supporters, and in the weeks and months after the court's arrival, it became the nucleus around which the broader exile community gathered, each new arrival adding to the human tapestry of a displaced world trying to maintain its dignity and its hope in borrowed rooms on foreign soil. Henry Waldegrave continued as comptroller of the royal household in exile, confirmed also as ambassador to France, in a role that had acquired overnight an entirely different meaning from the one it had carried when James was a reigning monarch. He was 27 years old, managing the domestic affairs of a court in exile, conducting diplomacy on behalf of a king whom almost no one outside France and the Jacobite community recognized as legitimately holding any throne. It was an extraordinary situation for a young man who had, only months earlier, been among the most promising figures of the English Catholic establishment, and it lasted barely 6 weeks. On the 24th of January, 1689, barely 6 weeks after the exile court had settled at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Henry Waldegrave, 1st Baron Waldegrave, died. He was 27 years old. The cause of his death is not recorded. What killed him, whether illness or the physical stress of the flight, or some condition that the medicine of the day could neither identify nor treat, has not survived the centuries that separate us from that cold January morning in France. What we know is simply the fact. A young man who had seemed, only months before, to be at the beginning of a long and promising life, was gone. Henrietta was 21 years old. She was in a foreign country, in a borrowed court, with small children, the eldest perhaps 4 years old, the youngest an infant, and her husband was dead. The England she had grown up in was now ruled by her Protestant half-sister and a Dutch king. The world her father had tried to build had lasted 3 years and was finished, and the man who had been supposed to build a future with her was buried in France, far from the family estates in Navestock that would now pass to a child who could not read. It was by any measure a devastating beginning to what would prove to be a very long widowhood. Henrietta was 21 years old. The life she had spent 5 years building, the marriage, the children, the household, the place in the Catholic court that had finally seemed secure, had been destroyed twice, first by the revolution that had ended the court's existence in England, and then by the death that had ended her husband's existence entirely. She was young, she was widowed, she was in a foreign country, and the father whose political choices had brought her to this position was now a pensioner of the French crown, sustained by the charity of a cousin, who had his own political reasons for the generosity, living in a borrowed chateau that was being made to serve as a royal court by the sheer will of a man who refused to stop believing that he was, in the eyes of God and legitimate law, still a king. It was an extraordinary situation, and Henrietta, with small children and no husband and no clear path forward, had to find a way to live within it. The particular conditions of Henrietta's widowhood at Saint-Germain deserve more attention than they typically receive. The exile court was, in its way, a world of considerable social complexity and surprising cultural richness. The Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye was a building of real grandeur. It had been a favourite royal residence of French kings since the reign of Francis III, and Louis XIV had himself been born there in 1638. though he had since moved his principal court to the new palace at Versailles. It had been modernized and expanded over the decades, and its apartments and gardens provided the exiled Stuart court with a setting that, however diminished from the real thing, was at least physically appropriate to the dignity of a royal household. The community that gathered around it was diverse and, in certain respects, remarkable. There were English nobles and their households, Scottish Jacobite supporters of various ranks, Irish soldiers and officers who had served James in the campaigns of 1689 to 1691 and who had followed him to France rather than submit to the Williamite settlement. There were priests and nuns and religious of various orders, scholars and physicians and musicians, the whole varied apparatus of a court that was trying, by sheer force of continuity, to sustain the claim that it remained the legitimate government of England, Scotland, and Ireland until the day when that claim could be made good. Schools were established for the children of exile families, so that the next generation would grow up educated and prepared for the restoration that was always expected but never quite arrived. Religious houses were founded or expanded to serve the spiritual needs of a community that was, in its collective faith, intensely and earnestly Catholic. It was, in the description of historians who have studied it, a whole displaced social world, and within that world, Henrietta occupied a position that was, by the standards of the exile community, one of real, if constrained, significance. Louis XIV's generosity in providing the chateau and the pension was genuine, but the pension was never quite adequate to the needs of a community that grew far beyond its original anticipated size. Hundreds of Irish soldiers had followed James to France, bringing with them families and dependents and the whole apparatus of a military community in displacement. English Catholic nobles had come with their households. Scottish Jacobites had added their numbers. The result was a community whose needs consistently exceeded the resources available to meet them, and the financial strain was a constant background reality of exile life that the formal ceremonies of the court could not entirely conceal. After the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, in which Louis XIV formally acknowledged William III as King of England, the political credibility of the exile cause was diminished, and the resources available to it were trimmed, and the community at Saint-Germain felt the change acutely. Henrietta navigated this world as the daughter of its king, which gave her rank and social visibility and access to whatever provision the court could make, but which did not protect her from the practical realities of a situation in which income from English estates could reach an exile in France only uncertainly and incompletely, and in which the pension from the French crown was spread across a community far larger than it had been designed to support. The infant James Waldegrave had inherited his father's English barony, and those English estates, the Waldegrave properties in Navestock, in Essex, were now being managed by English relatives and trustees in a country that Henrietta could not easily return to. She raised her children. She attended the chapel. She participated in the daily rituals of a court that maintained the ceremonies of royalty in the absence of the power those ceremonies were designed to express. She watched her brother James Fitzjames, now Duke of Berwick, his English title attainted by the Williamite government, accept a commission as Lieutenant General in the French army and begin to build, through genuine military excellence, the extraordinary career that would eventually make him Marshal of France. She watched her younger brother Henry decline toward the early death that came for him in December of 1702. She watched her youngest sibling Arabella take her vows and become Sister Ignatia at the Benedictine Abbey in Pontoise. She watched her father grow old in his borrowed chateau, his piety deepening with each year that passed without a restoration, his court gradually acquiring the character of a permanent rather than temporary institution. And she waited, as all widows in difficult circumstances must sometimes wait for the next chapter of her life to make itself known. In those 6 years of widowhood between Henry's death and her second marriage, Henrietta was not merely passive. She was managing a household in a foreign country, on uncertain income, managing the education and upbringing of small children in the particular atmosphere of the exile court, managing the social obligations of a woman of her rank in a community where rank and ceremony were maintained with deliberate insistence as assertions of legitimacy. She was present at the functions and the celebrations and the religious observances that punctuated the exile court's year. She was present when James II received visitors and held court, when the annual commemorations of Jacobite martyrs and defeats were observed, when the marriages and deaths and births of the community were marked in the chapel at Saint-Germain. She was, in short, doing exactly what the situation required her to do, being present, being loyal, being the daughter of the king in all the quiet ways that did not generate any particular historical record, but that constituted the actual substance of daily life in the exile community. 6 years is a long time, long enough for small children to grow into older children, who could hold conversations and express opinions and begin to develop the personalities they would carry into adulthood. Long enough for the initial shock of the revolution and the death and the displacement to settle into something more habitual. Not acceptance exactly, but accommodation. The practical adjustment to circumstances that are not going to change on the timescale of a human life's daily management. Long enough, perhaps, for loneliness to become simply a condition rather than a crisis. For Henrietta to have made what peace she could with the fact that she was a widow in her 20s, that the life she had been building had been destroyed, and that the world she now inhabited was the only one available to her until something changed. It came, eventually, though not in a form that anyone would have anticipated or chosen. It came in the form of a scandal and a pregnancy, and the particular kind of crisis that strikes at the heart of a family's self-understanding precisely because it cannot be explained away or managed out of existence. Henry Waldegrave was 27 years old. He had been married for 5.5 years. He had children who were still very young, and a career that had only just reached its first real heights of promise. And now he was gone. The cause of his death is not recorded. We do not know whether it was a fever or a chill from the winter crossing, or some condition that had been developing quietly and made itself fatal in the exhausting circumstances of the exile. What we know is the fact of it and the consequence of it, which was that Henrietta was left a widow in a foreign country with small children and no husband and no obvious path forward except the one that loyalty and circumstance together would eventually open. What would those first weeks and months of widowhood have felt like? The question is unanswerable in the specific sense. No letters from Henrietta have survived, no diary, no private account of her inner state in the weeks after Henry's death. What we have is the bare fact that she was 21 years old in France, with children aged perhaps 4, 2, and a few months, and that the man who had been her companion and her protector and the father of those children was dead at 27. Around her was the exile court, a community of hundreds of displaced English and Irish and Scottish Catholics, all processing their own losses and their own uncertainties, all managing the daily reality of having followed a king across the Channel and discovered that the crossing was not the beginning of a brief interruption, but perhaps the beginning of a permanent displacement. In this world, Henrietta was not alone in the sense of being isolated. She was surrounded by people, by the rituals of the court, by the religious community of the chapel and the priests and the daily mass that structured the exile community's spiritual life. But she was alone in the more significant sense, the particular loneliness of a person whose immediate future has been demolished by a death that nothing could have prepared them for. The years of her widowhood, between 1689 and 1695, were years in which the exile court at Saint-Germain settled gradually and uncomfortably into the shape of a permanent rather than temporary institution. The initial expectation that James would be restored within a year or two, that the revolution would be reversed by French intervention or Irish uprising or English dissatisfaction, gave way after the defeat at the Boyne in 1690 and the failed invasion plan of 1692, to the more sober recognition that the restoration, if it came, would not come quickly. The community that had gathered around the chateau, the Irish soldiers and English nobles and Scottish Jacobites and their families and dependents, built their lives accordingly. Schools were established for the children of exile families. Religious houses were founded or expanded. The social world of the court developed its own rhythms and hierarchies, its own marriages and births and deaths, its own ongoing conversation about faith and politics, and the possibility of a future that looked different from the present. For a young widow with small children in this community, the social and practical circumstances were not without their own particular difficulties. The exile court was, as we have noted, financially constrained. The pension from Louis XIV covered wages and basic provisions, but did not extend easily to the kind of comfortable domestic establishment that a woman of Henrietta's rank would have maintained in England. The children needed to be educated, and the schools that the exile community had established were available. But education in exile had its own limitations. The young James Waldegrave was growing up knowing himself to be an English baron. His father's title had passed to him in infancy, while living in a French chateau. Educated in the Catholic tradition of the exile community, absorbing the particular Jacobite understanding of the world that the court at Saint-Germain collectively maintained, he was being prepared for a future that might never come, the restoration of a Catholic Stuart king to the English throne, which would allow him to return to his English estates and his English title in the full exercise of their meaning. That this future never materialized, and that he would eventually have to make his peace with a very different England, was something that neither he nor his mother could have known in those years. In 1695, approximately 6 years after the death of Henry Waldegrave, something happened that broke the quiet of those years with sudden force. Henrietta became pregnant. She was not married. She was approximately 28 years old, a widow with young children, a woman who had lived for years in the households of devoutly Catholic exiles and who occupied, as the king's daughter, a social position that made her private choices very publicly visible. And James II, her father, was not prepared to receive this news with anything resembling equanimity. He sent her to Pontoise, to the Benedictine Abbey, where her youngest sister was living as Sister Ignatia. He did what fathers in his position did when a daughter's behavior embarrassed the household. He removed her from the embarrassing situation and replaced her with a controlled one. The Abbey was not a punishment in the punitive sense. It was a respectable destination, a place of genuine religious life and genuine Catholic community. But it was a removal, and it was intended as one. And Henrietta must have felt the message it sent with perfect clarity. The question of who fathered that child has never been answered to the satisfaction of the historical record. 2 names are associated with it. Mark Talbot, an Irish soldier of the exile community, the illegitimate son of the first Earl of Tyrconnell, appears in the popular tradition as the most likely candidate, with a dramatic story of a Bastille imprisonment attached to his name. But this story is not confirmed by sources of sufficient reliability to treat as settled fact, and Piers Butler, the man Henrietta married on the 3rd of April 1695, is the other possibility, though whether he was the father of the 1695 child, or whether he was simply a well-suited second husband chosen for entirely separate reasons of faith and social position, the record does not allow us to determine. The child itself, whether born alive, whether it survived, what became of it, leaves no trace in the sources that have come down to us. It is one of the genuine silences in Henrietta's story, a shadow at the center of a year that must have been among the most difficult of her life. What is certain is the man she married in April of 1695. Piers Butler, 3rd Viscount Galmoy, was born on the 21st of March 1652, which made him exactly 15 years older than Henrietta and 43 years old at the time of their marriage. He was a man of the Anglo-Irish Catholic tradition at its most committed and its most consequential, a descendant of the great Butler family of Ormond, bearing a viscountcy derived from the barony of Galmoy in County Kilkenny, and possessed of a record of service to the Jacobite cause that was as complete and as costly as the cause itself. He had served James II as Privy Councillor of Ireland, Lieutenant of the County of Kilkenny, and Colonel of the 2nd Regiment of Irish Horse. He had been at the Boyne and at Aughrim. He had lost in attainder the approximately 15,000 acres of Irish land that constituted the material foundation of his family's standing, and he had accepted all of this, the loss, the exile, the reduction of his circumstances to what a French pension and a French military commission could provide, without apparent complaint or deviation from the loyalty that had defined his life. In 1692, James II had created him Earl of Newcastle in the Jacobite peerage as an acknowledgement of that loyalty, a title without legal standing in England or Ireland, but one that meant everything in the moral economy of the exile court. It was this man, faithful, military, Irish, Catholic, 15 years her senior, who became Henrietta's second husband, and with whom she would live the middle and later decades of her life. The second marriage was, in its external character, typical of the kinds of marriages that the exile community arranged between its members, pragmatic in its origins, grounded in the shared values and shared circumstances of two people whose lives had been shaped by the same catastrophe, finding in each other a companionship that was suited to what the world they inhabited offered, rather than to what a more comfortable world might have allowed them to hope for. Piers Butler brought to the marriage his Jacobite credentials, his military experience, his titles, real in the Jacobite understanding and worthless in the English legal one, and the particular dignity of a man who had refused to purchase his survival at the price of his conscience. Henrietta brought the prestige of her royal connection, the acknowledged paternity of a king, the family name of the Waldegraves, and the particular warmth that comes from having been found worthy of a second chance after loss. They were, in sum, a well-matched pair for the world they were living in, and that is perhaps the most that can be said about a marriage whose interior the historical record has chosen not to preserve. The question of how Henrietta's older children received their new stepfather is also one that the record does not answer. The young James Waldegrave was perhaps 10 or 11 years old at the time of the second marriage, old enough to have opinions about the change in his household and in his mother's situation. Though what those opinions were, we cannot say. The young Arabella was perhaps 8. They had grown up with the memory of a father who had died when they were very small. The eldest, barely old enough to retain any clear recollection of him. The youngest, with none at all. Piers Butler was not replacing a vivid paternal presence in their daily lives. He was filling a role that had been functionally empty for the 6 years of Henrietta's widowhood, and doing so as a man whose Jacobite credentials and Catholic faith placed him squarely within the world the Waldegrave children had been raised in. Whether the relationship between stepfather and stepchildren was warm or merely civil, affectionate or simply correct, this is another interior that the record does not illuminate. The marriage produced no children together. Whatever the nature of the relationship between Henrietta and Piers, and the sources do not allow us to see its interior, it was evidently stable enough to have lasted until Henrietta's death 35 years later, even if in its final period husband and wife appear to have lived apart, he in Paris and she in Navestock, each maintaining the life that made most sense for them in the world as it had finally settled. This kind of arrangement, husband in France, wife in England, the formal bond maintained but the daily domestic reality of separate lives, was not unusual among the families of Jacobite exiles in the early 18th century. As the old Pretenders' cause slowly lost its political credibility, and the individuals who had built their lives around it found themselves pulled in different directions by the competing demands of loyalty and practical necessity. Piers Butler remained loyal to the end, died a Jacobite in Paris at 88, far from the island that had made him. Henrietta found her way home. Both choices were honourable. Both were, in their different ways, faithful to the circumstances that had shaped them. The years that followed Henrietta's second marriage were years of the long wait, the particular kind of waiting that characterises communities in exile, in which the hope of return is real enough to sustain daily life, but distant enough that daily life must be built on some other foundation as well. The community at Saint-Germain-en-Laye had, by the mid-1690s, settled into something resembling a permanent rather than temporary existence, and the texture of that life, its rhythms and its social architecture, its schools and its churches, and its ongoing military preparations, is worth understanding if we are to appreciate the world in which Henrietta and her second husband spent the middle decades of their lives. The exile court maintained all the formal structures of a royal household, appointments and ceremonies, household offices and religious observances, diplomatic correspondence and military preparations. James II received visitors, conducted the business of what he continued to regard as the legitimate government of England, and maintained the rituals of Catholic court life with an attention to form that the passage of time and the diminishment of resources did not erode. Louis XIV's annual pension of 600,000 livres continued to flow, though it was never quite adequate to the needs of a community that had grown far beyond its original anticipated size, and the financial situation of the court was one of perpetual strain beneath the surface of maintained dignity. After the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, in which Louis XIV formally acknowledged William III as King of England, a diplomatic concession that diminished the political credibility of the exile cause without entirely ending French material support, the community at Saint-Germain felt the change in its circumstances acutely, and the hope of a quick restoration grew noticeably dimmer. Yet within this constrained and sometimes difficult world, the community sustained itself with remarkable vitality. The Irish Brigade, the regiments of Irish Catholic soldiers who served in the French army under their own officers and their own colours, maintained a military culture that connected the exile community to the armies and the campaigns of Europe in a way that gave the community's men a sense of purpose and professional identity beyond the purely political. The schools that the Jesuits and other religious orders had established for the children of exile families educated a generation in the Catholic tradition and in the languages and manners that would allow them to function either in a restored Stuart England or in the continental courts, where many of them would eventually build their careers. The religious houses at Pontoise and elsewhere provided the women of the community, those who chose the religious life, with a structure and a vocation outside the domestic sphere. It was, in sum, a community that had done more than simply wait. It had built, within the constraints of its situation, a version of the life it had been forced to abandon, and Henrietta lived within that built world, contributing to its maintenance in the ways that women of her rank and position were expected to contribute. Henrietta's brother James Fitzjames, the Duke of Berwick, was in these years building the military reputation that would eventually make him the most celebrated of the Fitzjames children and one of the most discussed soldiers in Europe. He had entered French service formally in 1693, and he brought to his campaigns an energy and a tactical intelligence that Louis XIV recognized with rapidly escalating honors. He served in the Low Countries, in the sieges and set-piece battles of the 9 Years' War, and he was taken prisoner at the Battle of Landen in 1693 by forces under his uncle Marlborough's broader command, a capture that he accepted, by all contemporary accounts, with remarkable composure and without the kind of political compliance that capture might in other circumstances have produced. He refused to acknowledge William III when presented to him as a prisoner, a gesture of Jacobite defiance that must have required considerable nerve in the circumstances, and he was eventually exchanged and returned to French service, where his career continued its upward trajectory unimpeded. With the outbreak of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701, Berwick's career entered its most brilliant phase. He fought in Spain, in Italy, and across the wider European theatre of a war that reshaped the balance of power on the continent and produced some of the most celebrated military operations of the early 18th century. In 1706, Louis XIV rewarded his sustained and exceptional service with the rank of Marshal of France, the highest military honour that France could bestow, granted only for achievements of the most genuine distinction. The Battle of Almanza in April of 1707, where Berwick commanded the Bourbon forces against an allied army in southeastern Spain, and won a victory so decisive that it effectively settled the Spanish succession in favour of the Bourbon claimant, is still regarded by military historians as among the finest tactical performances of its era. He would go on to be created Duke of Fitzjames in the Peerage of France, and Duke of Leiria and Jericho in the Peerage of Spain, honours from the two kingdoms whose armies he had served with equal distinction, facing him across these same battlefields, with a brilliance that had already made him the most celebrated military figure in Europe, and would eventually be commemorated in the name of a palace built by a grateful nation, was John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, Berwick's maternal uncle, the man whose early career his sister Arabella had helped to launch, and who now commanded the armies of the Grand Alliance against his own nephew with the full professional respect that great soldiers sometimes develop for the opponents they find most formidable. It was, in human terms, an extraordinary situation. The two most celebrated commanders of their generation, the English Protestant and the French Catholic, the victor of Blenheim and the victor of Almanza, were aunt and nephew, their entire relationship rooted in the same household, the same faith, the same set of choices and counter-choices that the second half of the 17th century had forced upon the family of Arabella Churchill. It is worth pausing here to consider what Henrietta would have made of all this, the spectacle of her brother and her uncle conducting a war against each other on the battlefields of Europe. Both were men she was connected to by blood and by shared history. Marlborough had grown up in the same orbit as her mother, had received his first commission through Arabella's influence, had been present in and around the court of the Duke of York during the years of Henrietta's childhood. He was not a stranger. He was, in some complicated sense, family, or had been, until the politics of 1688 had drawn a line between the Churchill family and the Fitzjames family that could not easily be uncrossed, and her brother James was family in the most direct possible sense, the younger sibling she had grown up alongside in the household of the Duke of York, the boy who had shown his military gifts even as a young man in Hungary, the brother who had followed their father into exile as she had done, and who had found in the French service the arena in which those gifts could be fully expressed. Watching the two of them across the news that filtered through the exile court, the dispatches and the reports and the commentary that sustained the Jacobite community's awareness of the world beyond Saint-Germain, must have been an experience of unusual emotional complexity. Pride in her brother's achievements, something more complicated in relation to the uncle whose political and military choices had placed him permanently on the other side of the divide that the Glorious Revolution had created. Henrietta watched all of this from the margins. Her brother's victories were the talk of the exile court, celebrated as evidence that the Fitzjames blood carried something of genuine value, even if the English throne remained beyond reach. Her second husband, Piers Butler, continued his own military service, campaigning in Italy and Germany and across the broader European theatre in the service of Louis XIV, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant general in the French army and brigadier of cavalry. He was away from Saint-Germain for significant periods, as military service necessarily required. The War of the Spanish Succession was a continent-wide conflict fought simultaneously on multiple fronts, and the demands it placed on the officers of the Irish Brigade were continuous and physically exhausting. Henrietta managed the household in his absence, as military wives of the period routinely did, maintaining the domestic and social fabric of their shared life, with the practical self-sufficiency that the circumstances required. And she raised her children, the young James Waldegrave, who was growing from an infant who had arrived in France in 1688, into a young man who would need to decide what kind of life was available to the son of an English Catholic baron, who had grown up in the exile court of a deposed king, and the young Arabella Waldegrave, who would eventually find her vocation in the religious life, as her aunt Arabella Fitzjames had done before her. Then, in September of 1701, came the death that changed the emotional landscape of the exile world entirely. James II, Henrietta's father, the deposed king around whom the entire exile community had organized itself, died at Saint-Germain-en-Laye of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 67 years old. In the days before his death, according to the accounts that have survived, he lingered in a state of declining consciousness, attended by his priests and his family and the household officials who had served him through all the years of exile. His wife, Mary of Modena, was beside him. His son, James Francis Edward, the young man whose birth had precipitated the revolution, was present, and the court that had sustained itself on the hope of restoration for 13 years gathered around the bedchamber of the man who had been the reason for all of it, and waited for the end. Louis XIV came to Saint-Germain to visit James on his deathbed, a gesture of personal respect and political significance that was widely noted at the time. And when James died, Louis immediately recognized James Francis Edward Stuart as King James III of England and the faith of Scotland, a recognition that had no practical effect on who governed England, but that meant everything to the exile community as a statement that the cause had not died with its originator. William III, hearing of Louis's recognition of the Old Pretender, was reportedly furious, and the episode contributed to the deteriorating relations between England and France that eventually fed into the broader War of the Spanish Succession. For Henrietta, her father's death was the end of something irreplaceable. James II had been, in the most fundamental sense, the origin of everything, of her birth, of her faith, of the political world that had shaped every choice she had ever made. He had been complicated and rigid and sometimes harsh, and he had sent her to Pontoise during the scandal of 1695, and he had given her first husband his titles and his career and his early death in a foreign country. He had been the man who had made her who she was, for better and for worse, and whose choices she had followed into exile at a cost that she had never asked to pay, but had paid anyway, because loyalty was what her family and her faith and the world she had been raised in all required of her. He was gone now. The future, the remaining nearly 30 years of her life, would be lived in the aftermath of what his life had set in motion, in a world that had decisively moved on from everything he had tried to preserve. Sometime in the early years of the 18th century, the precise date is not documented, Henrietta Fitz-James made her way back to England. The decision, the practical arrangements, the emotional dimensions of that return, all of these are private to her and have not been preserved. What we know is the destination. She settled in Navestock, in Essex, in the countryside northeast of London, in the village that had always been the home of the Waldegrave family into which her first marriage had brought her. The return journey itself, wherever it took place along the unmarked timeline of those early post-exile years, would have been a passage through many different kinds of meaning. France had been her home for somewhere between 15 and 20 years, the years of her children's early childhood, the years of her widowhood and her second marriage, the years of watching her brother become one of the most celebrated soldiers in Europe, and her father age and die in a borrowed French chateau. These were not small years. They were the central years of her adult life, and the world they had taken place in was a French world, shaped by the rhythms of the exile court, by the French language and the French landscape, and the French Catholic tradition in which the exile community was embedded. Returning to England after so long meant returning to a country that had changed significantly during her absence, and that she herself had experienced, in some ways, as more of a concept. The kingdom her father had lost, the country her son's estates were in, the place that the Restoration was supposed to recover, than as a lived reality. The England she returned to was a country transformed. The Glorious Revolution had settled into established constitutional fact. William III had died in 1702, and Henrietta's Protestant half-sister Anne had reigned as Queen Anne until her own death in 1714, the last Stuart monarch to occupy the English throne. Under Queen Anne, England and Scotland had been united into the Kingdom of Great Britain by the Acts of Union of 1707, a constitutional change that would have significant consequences for the Jacobite cause, since it bound the Scottish and English thrones together in a way that made any future restoration more complex and more difficult. With Anne's death, the crown had passed under the terms of the Act of Settlement to the Hanoverian line, to George I, a German prince who spoke little English and had never visited the country he was about to govern, but who was Protestant and legitimate, and the choice that Parliament had made when it had determined that England would never again endure a Catholic monarch. The hope of a Stuart restoration had not entirely died. The Jacobite rising of 1715 demonstrated that, but it had grown dimmer than it had been in the early years of the exile, and with each passing decade it would grow dimmer still. Henrietta navigated this new Hanoverian England with the practical discretion that her entire life had trained her in. She was the daughter of a deposed king, the widow of an attainted Jacobite viscount, and the bearer of connections to the exile court that could, in a different political climate, have attracted uncomfortable official attention. The Jacobite Rising of 1715, which followed hard on the heels of the Hanoverian succession and involved a genuine military effort to restore James Francis Edward Stuart to the throne, with a Scottish army under the Earl of Mar and a landing in the north of England, had demonstrated that the cause her father had represented was not yet entirely dead, and the Second Jacobite Rising of 1745, which would come 15 years after Henrietta's death, would demonstrate it again with even greater force. But Henrietta, living quietly in Navestock in the years between those events, does not appear in any record as an active participant in Jacobite political life. She was the daughter of the cause rather than its agent, and the distinction was one that the Hanoverian government appears, on the available evidence, to have been content to observe. And yet she was also the mother of James Waldegrave, a man who had made the transition from Jacobite heritage to Hanoverian establishment with the pragmatic intelligence of someone who understood that the world had changed and that adaptation was the condition of survival. James Waldegrave had, by the time his mother returned to England, converted to the Church of England, accepted the requirements of English public life, and was building the diplomatic and political career that would eventually see his son elevated to the position of First Lord of the Treasury in 1757. The Waldegrave family's journey from exile court to Hanoverian establishment was accomplished within Henrietta's own lifetime, and she was present to witness its early stages, to see the son she had borne in Saint-Germain-en-Laye become an English Earl of the New Order, navigating Hanoverian London with considerably more ease than his parents had managed in the world the Revolution had destroyed. Whether she felt pride in this, or a more complicated emotion, a sense that the survival of her son required the effective abandonment of the cause for which his father had died and his family had sacrificed everything, is not something the record preserves. She was, by all indications, a woman who had learned to accept complexity without demanding that it resolve into something simpler, and perhaps that acceptance extended to the sight of her son making his peace with the Protestant establishment that her father had spent his reign attempting to dismantle. It is also worth noting, in these final years, the situation of her daughter, Arabella Waldegrave, born in 1687, the second of Henrietta's children, had by this period followed the path that the women of her family had a way of finding in moments of personal resolution. She had taken religious vows and become a nun, as her great-aunt Arabella Fitzjames had done before her, as the female members of the Fitzjames family seemed, across the generations, to have found a particular peace in doing. The Waldegrave daughter in the convent and the Waldegrave son in Hanoverian London, the two children of Henrietta's first marriage, had found their very different futures in the world that the Revolution had created, and both were settled in those futures by the time their mother came back to England to live out her remaining years near the family church in Navestock. Her second husband, Piers Butler, appears to have remained in France for the most part during these final years. The sources suggest that the couple lived separately, though without any formal rupture that the record has preserved. Piers continued his military career and his Jacobite associations in Paris, maintaining his connections to the exile court, even as that court became, with each passing year, a smaller and more peripheral thing. He died in Paris on the 18th of June, 1740, at the extraordinary age of 88, outliving Henrietta by 10 years, outliving James II by 39 years, outliving almost everyone who had formed the world of his prime. He was buried at St. Paul's Church in Paris, far from the Kilkenny and Wexford estates that the English Parliament had taken from him in 1697, far from the island that had defined his identity, but that he had refused to purchase back at the price of his loyalty. He died as he had lived, a Jacobite, a Catholic, an exile, and faithful. In Navestock, the landscape of Henrietta's final years was the landscape of an old Essex village, gently rolling farmland, ancient hedgerows, the slow pastoral rhythms of a countryside that had been inhabited and cultivated for 1,000 years, and that wore its history with the understated ease of places that have never needed to announce themselves. The Church of St. Thomas the Apostle, with its Waldegrave memorials accumulating across the generations, was the spiritual and social centre of the family's presence in this place, the building where they had worshipped and been married and baptised their children and eventually been buried, the physical evidence that the Waldegrave family had been here and intended to remain. Henrietta came to this church, not as a stranger, but as the widow of the man whose family had always worshipped within its walls, and as the mother of the man who was now its most prominent parishioner. The village of Navestock in the early 18th century was close enough to London to be connected to the life of the capital, a day's journey, more or less, depending on the condition of the roads and the season, and far enough away to maintain the quietness of a country community that had its own rhythms and its own concerns that were not primarily determined by the affairs of the court or the city. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place in which a woman with Henrietta's history could live quietly without attracting the kind of attention that her antecedents might otherwise have generated. She was the daughter of a deposed king, yes, but she was also the mother of the local earl, the widow of the local family's most distinguished recent member, a woman who had been away for a long time and had come home. In a village the size of Navestock, this was enough context for an ordinary life. She was near her son. She was in the place where the family she had married into had always been rooted. She was, after the extraordinary mobility of a life that had taken her from Restoration London to the court of James II, to the exile at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and finally back to England, at last, still. The travelling was over. The waiting was over. The long, patient work of surviving what her century had required of her was nearly done. The Church of St. Thomas the Apostle itself is one of those ancient English country churches whose continued existence across the centuries is itself a kind of quiet testimony. It stands in the Essex landscape with the particular quality of permanence that very old buildings acquire. The permanence not of invulnerability, but of persistence, of having weathered enough seasons and enough human turbulence to have earned the right to stand. The Waldegrave connection to it went back generations. The family had worshipped here, been married here, baptized their children here, buried their dead here, in the accumulated ritual of English country life that the upheavals of the 17th century had not managed to interrupt. The memorials inside it, stone and marble, Latin and English, the formal record of a family across the centuries, were the physical counterpart of the genealogies in the record books and the stories that families tell their children about who they are and where they came from. Henrietta was, in death, part of all of this. The woman who had been born illegitimate, who had spent decades in exile, who had twice married outside the formal expectations of an English noble family. She was laid here among the Waldegraves, in the church of the family she had entered by marriage, and her son had placed above her a stone that said she was illustrious and beloved and virtuous. It was, in the deepest sense, a homecoming. Her mother, Arabella Churchill Godfrey, was still alive in these years, a fact that seems almost improbable when one considers that Arabella had been born in 1648, had begun her relationship with James Duke of York around 1665, and was therefore living well into her 80s, while her daughter spent her final decade in Navestock. Arabella died in May of 1730, at the age of 82, some weeks after Henrietta. Henrietta died first, on the 3rd of April, 1730, in Navestock, Essex. She was buried 4 days later, on the 7th of April, at the church of St. Thomas the Apostle, the Waldegrave family church, the place where the memorials of the family she had entered by marriage 47 years earlier surrounded her in stone and silence. The woman who had been born in a private house in Westminster, who had been baptized Catholic, who had married at 16 and been widowed at 21, and followed her father into exile and lived for years in a borrowed chateau near Versailles, and scandalized her father and married again, and returned to England and lived quietly in an Essex village until her 63rd year. She was home, at last, in the only way that final things are home. The date of her death, the 3rd of April, is the same as the date of her second marriage, on the 3rd of April 1695, 35 years to the day. Whether this coincidence was noticed by those who buried her, whether James Waldegrave marked it when he arranged his mother's funeral, we cannot know. What we know is that the date is what it is, a small symmetry in a life that contained, as all long lives do, more symmetries and ironies and unexpected connections than any single telling can fully exhaust. Henrietta Fitzjames's eldest son, James Waldegrave, by April of 1730, the first Earl Waldegrave, a man of the Hanoverian establishment who had navigated the transition from Jacobite heritage to English peerage with intelligence and apparent equanimity, erected a memorial to his mother at the Church of St. Thomas the Apostle at Navestock. The inscription was composed in Latin, as was proper for a memorial of this kind and this period, and the translation that has survived speaks with a quiet dignity that is, in its way, more moving than any formal public tribute could have been. To God the best and greatest, here rests the most illustrious Lady Henrietta Waldegrave, beloved wife of Henry Baron Waldegrave, daughter of King James II, and the most noble Lady Arabella Churchill, sister of the most mighty prince, the Duke of Berwick. She was adorned not so much with splendour of birth, but just as much with all the virtues and qualities of mind and body. She died the 3rd of April, in the year of our Lord 1730, aged 63. Her dearest son, James, Earl, Viscount, and Baron Waldegrave, placed this memorial sacred to her happy memory. There is something deliberate and significant in the way this inscription is composed, and it is worth attending to its choices with some care. James Waldegrave was a man who had grown up in France, been educated in the exile community, and had then made the transition to England and to the Hanoverian establishment that his position as an English peer required. He had, by the time his mother died, converted to the Church of England and was building a career at the heart of the Protestant political order that his grandfather's choices had been specifically designed to prevent. He was, in other words, a man who had made a considerable accommodation with the world as it was, as opposed to the world as the exile community had hoped it would become. And yet the inscription he commissioned for his mother makes no concessions to the Hanoverian sensitivities that a more anxious man might have felt. It acknowledges her as the daughter of King James II, not as the daughter of the former king, not as the daughter of James Stuart, but as the daughter of the king, the title used without qualification or apology. It names the Duke of Berwick, who had been Marshal of France in the service of Louis XIV and Generalissimo of the Spanish forces, and who had spent his entire military career fighting against the Protestant allies of the Hanoverian settlement, as the most mighty prince, without embarrassment or hedging. What James Waldegrave was doing with this inscription was saying something clear and deliberate, that he knew who his mother was, that he was not ashamed of it, and that whatever accommodations he had made with the world for the sake of his own survival and advancement, he was not going to pretend, on the stone he placed over his mother's grave, that she was anything other than the person she actually had been. She was the daughter of a Catholic king. She was the sister of the most celebrated Catholic general of the age. She was a woman whose life had been shaped by the faith and the loyalty and the political disaster of the Stuart cause. And she was, above all of this, a woman of virtue. That was what her son wanted the centuries to know. The bloodline that Henrietta passed through her eldest son is one that extended across the centuries to a woman whom the world knows by a different name altogether, through James Waldegrave, the first Earl, and through the Waldegrave Earls who followed. The descent runs eventually through the Spencer family, the family of John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, whose blood combined with the Waldegrave blood through marriages across the generations, and arrives in the 20th century with Diana Frances Spencer, who became Diana, Princess of Wales, and who gave to the English royal family 2 sons who carry Henrietta's blood in their veins today. Prince William, who will one day be king, is a descendant of Henrietta Fitz-James, the illegitimate eldest daughter of the Catholic king, whose deposition was supposed to end the Stuart bloodline's connection to the English throne. The royal blood that Henrietta carried, illegitimate, set aside, never allowed to count in the formal calculations of succession, found its way back into the royal line by the long, patient route of the ordinary bloodline, across the centuries and the generations, to arrive in people who had no idea she had existed, the restoration that her father had prayed for and that the exile community had waited for and that never came. In a sense, in the deepest and most ironic biological sense, it did come, just not in the way anyone had imagined. There is something quietly extraordinary in this, though the extraordinariness is only visible across centuries. Henrietta lived all her life on the margins of royal power, close enough to feel its warmth, never quite close enough to claim its shelter. Her father was a king. Her half-sisters were queens. Her brother was a Marshal of France. Her uncle was the Duke of Marlborough. And she, the eldest Fitz-James' daughter, lived in a village in Essex and was remembered primarily by a Latin inscription her son put up in the local church. And yet the bloodline persisted, and the virtues her son praised, the qualities of mind and body that the epitaph commended without specifying, were the kind of virtues that do not require a crown to be real, and that have a way of persisting across the generations, even when the formal structures that surround them have changed beyond recognition. It is worth noting, too, the remarkable family connection that runs through Henrietta to one of the great dramas of early 18th century European military history. John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, Henrietta's maternal uncle, the man whose career his sister Arabella had helped to launch by securing him his first commission in 1665, spent the War of the Spanish Succession commanding the Allied forces against the French and their allies on the battlefields of Europe. On the other side of those same battlefields, commanding the French and Spanish armies with a brilliance that contemporaries acknowledged as among the finest military performance of the age, was James Fitz-James, Duke of Berwick, Henrietta's brother, Marlborough's nephew, the illegitimate son of Arabella's royal lover. Uncle and nephew, English and French, Protestant and Catholic, each at the head of great armies, facing each other across the killing grounds of Flanders and Spain. Their entire relationship was rooted in the same household that produced Henrietta, in the connection between Arabella Churchill and James, Duke of York, that had begun when Arabella was a 15-year-old maid of honour in 1663. Berwick died in June of 1734, 4 years after Henrietta, killed by a cannonball at the siege of Philipsburg on the Rhine. An ending as direct and undiscriminating as artillery always is, making no distinction between the Marshal of France and the youngest private in his regiment. He was 63 years old, which was precisely the age at which his sister had died. In the mathematics of their family, 63 appears to have been a kind of terminus. For Henrietta, in the spring of 1730. For James, in the summer of 1734. As though the Fitzjames children had each been allotted roughly the same span in which to make what they could of the lives that the Revolution had given them. The death of Berwick at Philipsburg provoked genuine mourning across the courts of Europe. In France, where he had served for 4 decades with distinction that had made him one of the most celebrated figures in the kingdom, and in Spain, where he was remembered with equal honour. Louis XV ordered a state funeral. The tributes that poured in described him as one of the greatest commanders of his age, a man of brilliant tactical instinct, of personal bravery, and of the kind of absolute military competence that impresses even those who have fought against it. He was given a permanent place in the military pantheon of France. His English title had been attainted by the Williamite government decades before, and his English connections were those of a man who had been born in England but had never really lived there as an adult, who had spent his entire active life in France and Spain, in the service of kings who were not the king his father had been, and not the king his father had wanted him to serve. He was, in the deepest sense, a man of exile, not an Englishman who had gone to France, but an exile son who had made France his country by the choices that the Revolution had forced upon his family. Henrietta had been spared the news of his death by 4 years. She had died in April of 1730, and he in June of 1734, and whatever grief she might have felt at the loss of the brother, whose career had been the most brilliant expression of the Fitzjames family's gifts, that grief was one she did not have to bear. She had died while he was still alive, still serving, still the celebrated Marshal of France, whose victories the exile court had celebrated, as evidence that the blood of James II was worth something, even if his throne had been lost. She died, in other words, while the family she had been born into was still, in at least one of its members, producing greatness. That is a quieter ending than it might have been, and perhaps a better one. Her daughter Arabella Waldegrave, meanwhile, had taken the path that her great-aunt Arabella Fitzjames and her great-grandmother's household had in some ways always pointed toward, the path of religious life, of the convent, of the enclosed world where faith was the whole substance of existence rather than its background. She became a nun, in the tradition of the Fitzjames women who had preceded her, and she died in 1740, 10 years after her mother, the same year as her stepfather Piers Butler. The coincidence of those deaths in 1740, 10 years after Henrietta's own, rounds off the story of the immediate family in a way that feels, again, almost too neat for reality, and yet is simply what the historical record shows. And so the family ended, or rather, it continued in its descendants, as families always do, but the immediate generation of Henrietta and her children and her siblings and her parents was over. The world they had inhabited, the world of the exile court, of the Catholic Jacobite cause, of the long hope of restoration, was itself fading. The second Jacobite rising of 1745, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, Henrietta's half-nephew, the grandson of James II, and Mary of Modena, would be the last serious attempt to recover the Stuart throne. It would end in the catastrophe of Culloden in April of 1746, and it would end the Jacobite cause as a practical political project forever. Charles Edward Stuart would live until 1788, dying in Rome, a broken old man, the last significant representative of the cause that Henrietta's family had sacrificed so much to sustain. But all of that was in the future when Henrietta died, quietly, in Navestock, in the spring of 1730. What she knew, in her final years, was the village and the church and the son who had found his way to a different kind of life in a different kind of England. What she left behind was a stone with Latin words, a bloodline that persisted, and the memory, held by those who knew her, and by this telling, and by whatever future tellings her story might receive, of a woman who had navigated one of the most turbulent centuries in English history with a faith and a dignity that the formal records have not always been adequate to preserve. As we draw near to the close of Henrietta's story, there is a quality of her life that deserves to be named directly, because it is the quality that the historical record most consistently fails to honour in women of her kind and her time. It is the quality of endurance, not the dramatic endurance of the martyr, who chooses suffering in a single defining moment of public witness, not the celebrated endurance of the soldier, who survives battles and is rewarded with honours for having done so. It is, rather, the endurance that gets up every morning and faces a life that has not gone according to hope, that manages the daily responsibilities of children and household and social position in conditions that do not make any of this easy, that maintains its dignity and its faith and its sense of self across decades of difficulty, without the comfort of certainty about whether the difficulty will ever end. Henrietta was born in 1667 into a situation that was, by definition, precarious. She was illegitimate, she was Catholic, and she was the daughter of a man whose political and religious choices were moving, slowly and then all at once, toward a confrontation with the Protestant establishment of his own country. She had no control over any of these facts. They were the conditions of her existence, given to her by birth, and she spent her life navigating them as honestly and as faithfully as she could. She did not choose the circumstances of her birth, as none of us choose ours. She chose, instead, how to live within those circumstances, and that choice, repeated day after day across 63 years, is the substance of her story. There is a temptation, when looking at lives like Henrietta's, to search for the dramatic gesture, the moment of defiance, the speech to the assembled court, the single act that crystallizes a lifetime of meaning into something that the historical record can easily hold. But Henrietta's life did not offer that kind of moment, and even if it had, she does not appear to have been the kind of person who sought it. Her courage was of a different, and in some ways more demanding kind. The courage that manages without certainty, that endures without applause, that maintains its commitments not in a single terrible hour, but across a lifetime of ordinary days that were sometimes anything but ordinary in their inner demands. She married young, in an arrangement made by her father's calculation, to a man she may barely have known. She bore children. She lost her husband, suddenly, in a foreign country, when he was 27 years old and she was 21, and both of them had barely understood what their life together might become. She raised those children in the exile court of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, on the uncertain income of a pension stretched across a community too large for it, in a world that could not quite bring itself to admit that the restoration it was waiting for was not coming. She had a relationship that produced a pregnancy that shamed and enraged her father, who sent her away to a convent. She married again, a good man, a loyal man, a man 15 years older than herself, and the marriage was stable and childless and lasted until she died. She watched her father die in his borrowed chateau. She watched her brother blaze across the battlefields of Europe. She watched her children grow up and find their places in a world different from the one she had sacrificed everything to preserve. And then she came home, to Navestock, to the village of the family she had married into, to the church of St. Thomas the Apostle, where the Waldegrave memorials mark the passage of the generations, and she died there on a spring day in April of 1730, at the age of 63, and her son put up a stone that said she was a woman of virtue. She was adorned not so much with splendour of birth, as with all the virtues and qualities of mind and body. Consider what this means, coming from a son who had himself made every accommodation that the world required of him, who had converted to the Protestant establishment, who had built his career in Hanoverian England, who had done everything that a pragmatic intelligence and a desire for survival suggested he should do, and yet, when he came to write his mother's memorial, he did not write about her royal blood first, though that blood was remarkable. He did not write about her social position, though it was distinguished. He did not write about the political cause to which she had devoted the central years of her life, though that cause had consumed everything. He wrote about her virtues. He wrote about her qualities of mind and body. He wrote, in other words, about who she was, about the person he had known across a lifetime of observation and love. And what he wrote was that she was good, not successful, not celebrated, not powerful. Good. This is what her son knew about her. This is what the centuries have preserved faintly in the records and the genealogies and the occasional footnotes where her name appears. And this is what we have tried tonight to remember fully, to see past the footnotes and the genealogies and the connections to more famous people, and to understand her as a person in her own right, living her own life with her own faith and her own losses and her own quiet, sustained, unspectacular, completely real courage. Henrietta Fitz-James, the eldest daughter of James II, and Arabella Churchill, Baroness Waldegrave and Viscountess Galmoy, is buried in the churchyard at Navestock, Essex. The stone that her son placed there is still there. The church is still standing. And the spring of 1730, when she died, and her son grieved, and her mother outlived her by 7 weeks. That spring is in the past now, 3 centuries gone, but not entirely unreachable, not entirely silent, not entirely forgotten. There is a final dimension of Henrietta's story that deserves consideration before we take our leave of her entirely, the dimension of faith, which was not incidental to her life, but absolutely central to it, the thread that runs beneath every event we have followed from her birth to her burial, and that connects them all into something coherent. Catholicism in 17th and early 18th century England was not merely a religious preference. It was an identity, a political position, a social affiliation, and in certain periods a genuinely dangerous commitment that required both courage and intelligence to maintain. The history of English Catholicism in this period is a history of persistence, of families that maintained their faith through generations of legal penalty and social marginalization, that educated their children through unofficial channels and worshipped privately in their own chapels, that maintained their connections with Rome and with the European Catholic world, and waited, patiently, and not always without bitterness, for the conditions of English life to change in their favour. The Fitz-James family was, in a very particular sense, at the centre of that history. They were the children of the only Catholic king England had seen since the Reformation, the children whose father had tried to change those conditions through royal authority and had been defeated, and who had inherited the consequences of that defeat without having participated in the choices that produced it. Henrietta had been raised in this faith from birth. The Mass, the Rosary, the Catholic understanding of the sacraments, The particular texture of Catholic piety, with its emphasis on the intercession of saints and the real presence in the Eucharist and the authority of the Church of Rome. These were not abstract beliefs to her, but the living substance of her religious life, practiced daily in the households she had inhabited from childhood to old age. Both of her marriages were Catholic marriages, conducted within the Catholic understanding of matrimony, even in conditions where Catholic marriages had no legal standing in England. Her daughter, Arabella Waldegrave, became a nun. Her own younger sister had become a nun. Her faith was not merely inherited but lived, the kind of faith that is tested by adversity and that either breaks under the testing or becomes, through the testing, something harder and more essential than it was before. Her son, James Waldegrave, eventually conformed to the Church of England, the price of participation in English public life that the Hanoverian settlement required, and that the children and grandchildren of Jacobite exiles paid routinely as the condition of building careers and lives in the England that had been shaped by the Glorious Revolution. Whether Henrietta herself ever made any such accommodation is not recorded. She died in Navestock, which was an Anglican parish, and was buried in an Anglican church, but neither of these facts necessarily implies a formal conversion. The English recusant tradition had always required a degree of navigation of official Anglican structures, and burial in a parish church was not always a matter of theological choice. What the record does not show is any evidence that Henrietta repudiated the faith she had been raised in, and the weight of the evidence, the Catholic marriages, the Catholic children, the Catholic exile community in which she had spent the central decades of her life, suggests strongly that she carried her faith to the end. There is also the matter of Henrietta's position within the longer history of the Fitzjames family and the Fitzjames siblings, and what their collective story tells us about the human cost of the great political and religious conflicts of the late 17th century. 4 children born to Arabella Churchill and James, Duke of York, Henrietta, James, Henry, and Arabella. 4 lives shaped by the same set of circumstances, the same royal paternity, the same Catholic faith, the same dependent position in a court that was itself in a precarious relationship with the official religious settlement of England, and 4 lives that developed in very different directions, and that all bore in different ways the marks of the revolution that destroyed the world they had been born into. Henrietta, the eldest, was the one who stayed closest to the conventional shape of a life: marriage, children, widowhood, a second marriage, a return to England, a quiet old age in the village of the family she had married into. Her story is the most domestic of the 4, and perhaps for that reason it has received the least attention from historians drawn to more spectacular narratives. But it was also the story of the one who endured the longest, who outlived all 3 of her younger siblings, who was present when their father died and when her mother outlived her by 7 weeks, who carried the memory of the family across more decades than any of the others managed to accumulate. James, the middle son, built a career of extraordinary brilliance in the French and Spanish service, rose to the rank of Marshal of France, and died in action at 63 at the siege of Philipsburg in June of 1734, 4 years after Henrietta. He was the celebrated one, the one the history books remember most readily, the one whose victories at Almanza and across the battlefields of Europe secured his place in the permanent record of military history. And yet he too was, in the deepest sense, a man who never quite belonged to the country of his blood, who served France and Spain with genuine distinction, but who could never serve England, the kingdom that had rejected his father and attainted him, and who died in the service of a foreign king on a foreign river. Henry Fitzjames, the younger brother, died at 29 in December of 1702 in the south of France, before the great events of the War of the Spanish Succession had fully developed. He left behind a daughter who became a nun and a wife who survived him, and a life that had not had the opportunity to express whatever potential it contained. And Arabella Fitzjames, the youngest, died at 30 in 1704 in her Pontoise convent, having spent her adult life within the enclosure as Sister Ignatia, the sister who had chosen the most complete form of withdrawal from the world, and who found in that withdrawal the kind of settled peace that none of her siblings were able to find in the secular life. 4 children, born royal, raised in exile or in the aftermath of exile, shaped by the choices of a father who believed he was right and paid the highest price that a king can pay for being wrong. Their lives are, collectively, one of the more poignant family stories of the late 17th century, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the cumulative weight of what they all bore, and the different ways they bore it, and the varying degrees of worldly success and human peace that they each managed to achieve before their time ran out. Of the 4, Henrietta was the last. She outlived them all. The celebrated brother, the quiet brother, the devout sister. She was the eldest, and she endured the longest. And in April of 1730, she died in a village in Essex, surrounded by the memorials of the family she had married into almost half a century before, with her son near and her faith intact, and her long, complicated, remarkable, ordinary life finally complete. Her son, James Waldegrave, put up a stone. The stone has lasted 300 years. The church has lasted longer still. And the blood she carried, royal by origin, irregular by circumstance, persisting by the quiet, patient logic of ordinary human reproduction across the generations, eventually found its way to people who carry it today without knowing where it came from or what it cost. The 3rd of April, 1730. Navestock, Essex. A woman of 63 years, the daughter of a king, the mother of an earl, the widow of a baron and a viscount, a woman who had lived in the exile court of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and in the village of Navestock, and in the uncomfortable middle space between the world she had been raised to inhabit and the world she had actually been required to live in. A woman of faith and of endurance, and of the particular quiet courage that a long life in difficult circumstances produces in the people who have the character for it. She was adorned not so much with splendor of birth as with all the virtues and qualities of mind and body. Her son wrote that, and tonight, after all these hours of following her story, after travelling with her from the candlelit apartments of Restoration London to the borrowed grandeur of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and back again to the quiet Essex churchyard, where the Waldegrave memorials accumulate in the old stone silence, we know that what he wrote was true. We know it because we have seen it, in the choices she made and the losses she bore, and the life she built from the materials that her century gave her, which were not the materials she would have chosen, but which were the ones she had, and with which she did more than enough. Tonight, we remembered her, and in remembering her, we honored the kind of life that history most often overlooks, the life that did not make speeches or command armies, that did not wear a crown or change the terms on which its century understood the world, but that was lived with faithfulness and with grace, and with the particular kind of courage that quiet endurance requires. She was, in the end, exactly what her son's inscription said she was, and that was more than enough. Thank you for spending this evening with Sleepy Crown Reborn, and with Lady Henrietta Fitzjames. If her story has found you some rest tonight, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which moment of her life stayed with you most would mean a great deal to this small family of history listeners. Sleep well, dear listener. We will see you next time.